Good evening. It is 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and the polls are closed in 16 more states. ABC News wishes to project that Ronald Reagan has won in the state of Texas with its 29 electoral votes. The polls are still open in some parts of the states, namely in El Paso, and there is an important House race there where your vote will still count. No Democrat has won the presidency without carrying Texas. ABC News projects that Mr. Reagan has won in the state of New Jersey. The Republicans have won it in the last 4 presidential elections. ABC News projects Mr. Reagan is the winner in the state of Missouri with its 11 electoral votes. ABC News projects that Mr. Reagan has won in Tennessee. He won it only by half a point in 1980. He wins it again tonight. And ABC News projects that Mr. Reagan is the winner of the 8 electoral votes in Oklahoma, part of his western base.
Peter, with the additional states closed, there are now enough electoral votes voted on and floating around to choose a president. We now project Connecticut to have gone to Mr. Reagan with its 8 electoral votes. Kansas for Mr. Reagan, 7 electoral votes by our projection. Maine, our projection is that Ronald Reagan has carried it, and it's 4 electoral votes. Delaware, our projection is that Reagan has carried Delaware with 3 electoral votes. And here's a big one. Illinois, Ronald Reagan, 24 electoral votes. Now the first victory tonight for Walter Mondale in the District of Columbia. 3 electoral votes for Mondale. Peter?
The electoral vote for Mr. Mondale there in the District of Columbia, adding up 254 for Mr. Reagan, 270 needed to win. Mr. Reagan is 16 short. Mr. Mondale has 3.
This is ABC News coverage of the 84 vote. From ABC News election headquarters in New York, David Brinkley and Peter Jennings.
Good evening. At this particular point of the evening, the polls are closing, as I think we said, in 16 more states around the country, and some, of course, have been closed for an hour and a half in some cases, and we have a couple of more projections to make. In the state of Massachusetts, ABC News projects that the Lieutenant Governor, John Kerry, has defeated Ray Shammy, the Republican. That was a place where Mr. Reagan went and campaigned rather fervently in the hope of getting Ray Shammy elected over John Kerry. ABC News predicts that the former Lieutenant Governor, now the Senator-elect, that was an open race because Paul Tsongas was retiring, now goes to the Democrats. ABC News also predicts that Joe Biden is the winner of the Senate race in the state of Delaware. He is the incumbent there. His opponent was John Burris. Joseph Biden, who is considered a presidential candidate in '88, was running for his second term. David?
Now we have two more Senate projections. First in New Jersey, where we project that the incumbent senator, Bill Bradley, the great baseball star of years past, now the incumbent, has been re-elected, basketball, not baseball, has been re-elected in New Jersey. In Oklahoma, we project the winner to be David Boren, who is the incumbent, the Democrat David Boren, in Oklahoma for the Senate.
ABC News also wants to make a couple of other projections on the Senate side. In the state of Kansas, we project that Nancy Kassebaum, who is running for her second term, is the winner of the state the Senate race in Kansas, defeating James Mayer, the Democrat. She running, as I said, for her second term. In Texas, here is a very big one, a very toughly fought race. ABC News projects that Congressman Phil Gramm, the Republican, has defeated the state senator Lloyd Doggett. That is, of course, an open seat in Texas. It became open when Senator John Tower decided to retire from the Senate to do, among other things, he says, teach for a living. Michigan. ABC News projects at the moment, am I correct, that in the state of Michigan, Carl Levin, in again a very tough race for a long period of time, has defeated the former astronaut and Republican Jack Lousma. A lot of money spent in that campaign for Carl Levin to hold his seat in the Senate, running as he was for his second term.
Peter, here's another one. This is from Tennessee. Our projection is that the winner for the Senate in Tennessee is Albert Gore, Jr., son of Albert Gore, his father, who served in the Senate for a good long time. That is the seat occupied now by Senator Howard Baker, Majority Leader of the Senate, who is retiring because I gather he wants to run for president 4 years from now.
And we have one more at the moment in the state of Maine, the incumbent Republican, William Cohen, running for his, Cohen, I should say, to be more specific, running for his second term against the state representative, Elizabeth Mitchell. We project that Senator Cohen is the winner there. Elizabeth Mitchell, one of the 10 women running in Senate races throughout the country tonight. David?
One of the 10 women running against the only poet in the United States Senate. He's a rather good poet.
Yeah.
Quite respected. Once in a while he gets out a slim volume of verse and passes it around Washington. And we all read it with great pleasure.
People often wonder, where they first heard his name on the national scene, and I think it was probably from the Judiciary Committee during Watergate, when he got a lot of publicity.
Right, it was. He was ready to impeach Nixon before most other Republicans were.
That's right.
Now, as I say, there are enough electoral votes out now, loose, voted on, and we will no doubt soon have them to elect a president. As soon as we have them, we'll bring them to you.
Can we take a quick look at that electoral board again? Because, as I said, those projections, both at the presidential level and the Senate level, have been coming fairly fast. Mr. Reagan has 254 electoral votes at the moment. Mr. Mondale has 3, which he picked up in the District of Columbia, 270 needed to win. In just a moment, by the way, there's the popular vote at the moment. We're now up to 4% of the popular vote, and the spread remains about the same as the vote piles up now out into the Midwest, with Mr. Reagan having 61% of the vote, just a little more than 1 million, almost 2 million. Mr. Mondale with 39% of the vote. When we come back, which we will do in just a minute or so, we'll talk to James Baker, the Chief of Staff at the White House. Almost guess what he thinks about this evening so far.
Easy to guess.
ABC News coverage of the 84 vote continues.
Shortly after 8 in the East, we've brought you our projected returns from 22 states where the polls are closed. There are 4 states where the polls are closed that we are unable to call as yet because the results are too close. They are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Massachusetts. We'll have them sooner or later. Peter?
David, just to get away from the numbers for a second and talk a little bit about the personalities in the campaign. Maxine Isaacs, who is Walter Mondale's press secretary, tells us what he has been doing this evening. He has, among other things, been preparing a statement for his supporters, but has also been over to see his father-in-law in the hospital, who fell the other day and broke his legs. And then I guess this is not at all unexpected. Edward Rollins, who is the president's campaign manager, was asked a short while ago whether or not he thought the president was going to sweep 50 states. He said not yet, but it is close, which leads us to James Baker, who is the White House Chief of Staff and who joins us this evening from a hotel room. It looks like it can only be a hotel room in Los Angeles, quite close to, of course, where the president is watching electoral returns. Mr. Baker, are you like to make the same predictions that Mr. Rollins is making, that the president may take 50 states?
Well, I wouldn't differ with that prediction, Peter, as long as you say might, because it looks like the projections that you've got there are very, very encouraging in that direction. I do think that it looks like the president will get a very, very significant proportion of the popular vote tonight, and should take clearly the majority of the states.
I want to ask you a slightly philosophical question. I want to know whether you think at the end of this campaign people have understood the issues, or do they really just understand the slogans?
No, I think people do understand the issues. I've read a lot, as I'm sure you have, that the campaign's all fluff and pretty pictures and balloon drops and that sort of thing. But I tend to disagree with that. And I think one reason that the president has been so strong throughout this election is because the American people appreciate the record of the first 4 years. And we've had 2 records here in this campaign to contrast, and we hope and believe that we've contrasted those records effectively.
Are you going to stay in the White House after the election?
Well, I've said I'm going to do what the president wants me to, David, and
Wait a minute,
I have every indication that...
Jim, hold on. You will want to hear this. We now project the winner in Michigan to be Mr. Reagan, which gives him the electoral votes to make him president for a second term. It gives him a total of 274. Now, you don't always get news that good when you get on the television.
No, you're absolutely right, and that is superb news, and we haven't even gotten to the West yet, have we?
All right, no, 270 votes, and that's that makes Mr. Reagan. Jim, thank you. Thanks very much for being with us. I can't always give you news.
I'd like to hold him around for a second, if I may. Let's Let me just make a couple of points here. Both candidates, do you mind standing by for 1 minute, Mr. Baker?
Not a bit.
Both candidates, by the way, have agreed that they are not going to concede and they are not going to claim victory until all the polls are closed, and that includes in California, which will be 11 o'clock, just under 2 hours from now, Eastern Standard Time, at least we're operating on in these clocks. And we're going to remind you again that even though we projected the president has enough electoral votes to be re-elected, there are very important races all around the country. Let me come back, having said that, to you, Mr. Baker, and ask you a self-interest question. The president gave his last news conference to the press in July. If all these projections are correct, and we believe they are, Mr. Reagan is re-elected, is he going to be more accessible to the press in a second term?
Well, I think he's going to be as accessible as he's been in the first, and I really can't accept the premise of your question, Peter, because after all, this is the first incumbent president in history, I suppose, with a 20-point lead in the polls, who's ever agreed to debate his opponent in the context of a general election campaign. In addition to that, while he hadn't held as many formal evening press conferences, perhaps, as some others, if you add up all the times that he's spent in interviews and with the press, they come to a significant amount of time. I'm not so sure it's the number of evening press conferences that ought to be counted. After all, Jimmy Carter in 1980, when he ran for this office, only held 6 press conferences, and President Reagan's held 5 already this year. So,
all right, one question, if I may, about policy. And again, we base it on our projections. The polls have not all yet closed. What would you like the president to take as his absolute first priority in a second term?
Well, it's not a question of what I would like for him to take. It's a question of what he has already said his absolute first priority is going to be. And he spoke to that question yesterday when asked. He said his top priority is going to be peace and the negotiation or the obtaining of a meaningful arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union. That's on the foreign side. As far as the domestic side is concerned, he's made it clear that major federal spending reductions and tax simplification are going to be his major priorities.
Well, in the meantime, Mr. Baker, I have some more good news for you, the Republicans.
I'll stay here as long as you've got it, David.
All right, fine. We have 2 projections in the races for governor. First, in Missouri, our projection is that the winner is the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, a Republican. And in Delaware, our projection is that the winner is the Lieutenant Governor, Michael Castle, a Republican, in Delaware. Those are people, Mr. Baker, you, and if you stay in the White House, you and the others will be dealing with in the next. And thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, David.
Right.
David, you were talking about the Senate races a little while earlier. We now have Phil Gramm standing by in College Station, Texas, who is the winner by the ABC News projection in the Senate race in Texas. An open seat, as we said, because John Tower is retiring. Senator-elect Gramm, if our projections are correct, thank you very much for joining us. Why do you think you won?
Well, Peter, I think we won for the simplest and most old-fashioned of reasons, and that is I was right on the issues facing Texas and America. I'd been a leader in the House in the adoption of the Reagan program, and that program is working for the working people of Texas.
Back before the Republican convention was being held in Dallas, Texas was seen as pretty much of a toss-up between Mr. Mondale and Mr. Reagan. What do you think went bad for the Democrats down there?
Well, I don't know that it was so much things going bad for the Democrats as that things went well for the people of Texas. Our economy is booming despite the flatness of the oil market, despite the peso devaluation. We've had 850,000 new jobs in Texas under the Reagan program. The inflation rate has come to a standstill in our state. We're in a building boom in several of our big cities. And I think the overwhelming feeling of the people of Texas was that the Reagan program was working. They were going to re-elect Reagan to see that program through to a successful conclusion. And obviously, I'm happy tonight that they decided to send me to the Senate to give me a bigger shovel and doing more work on it than I ever had in the House.
Well, you were a Democrat until rather recently, Mr. Gramm, and in fact, in the House, the Democrats are angry at you because they thought you were working with the Republicans more closely than with them, right?
They were right.
Okay, fine. Now you're a Republican. And you and your opponent ran what people keep telling us was a dirty campaign. Would you so describe it?
Well, it was a tough campaign. Obviously, you're talking to me, you're going to get my perspective.
Yeah.
I thought my opponent could not run on his record, had to try to attack me, obviously. I was more closely identified with the president than any member of the House, and trying to run against me on my record was tough. So my opponent decided to attack me personally. That's behind us. The race is over, and if in fact your projections are right and I win, I'm going to be representing my opponent along with the other people in Texas, and I'm putting all that bitterness behind me.
Phil Gramm in College Station, Texas, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Peter.
Sander Van Oker is, as I said earlier, covering the Senate for us. He is in Washington now, and he is with the present Senate Majority Leader and the outgoing Senator from Tennessee, Howard Baker. Sandy?
Thank you, gentlemen. Senator, you're retiring as Senate Majority Leader. You've joined 2 law firms. You're on the board of Gazette newspapers. Make this official tonight. Are you going to declare your candidacy right on the air tonight?
Not tonight, Sandy. But I tell you what, let me come back in a couple of years and we'll talk about it again.
Do you plan to run for the presidency?
I would like to run for president. I make no bones about that, but I shouldn't make that decision until much later. So what I intend to do is to practice law. I intend to save enough time to travel around the country and to keep my political contacts alive. And then I'll make a judgment on what to do, probably right after the 1986 elections.
I ask you this because you've been there. You won't be here now. Presidents, even when they win overwhelmingly, second term, they have trouble with the Senate of the United States. Ike had it. Others have had it. What do you think is going to be the future for Ronald Reagan?
I think Ronald Reagan will get along very well with this Senate. I think he's going to have an enhanced majority in the Senate. I think that his sweep this time and the improved numbers on the Republican side will also have a sobering effect on the Democratic opposition. I think he'll do very well.
Could I invite cloture? Yes or no for 88?
Oh, let's wait and see.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming by, Senator. Good luck.
Thanks.
Sandy, thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Baker. Just a couple of reminders. We are now again between 8 and 8:30 in Eastern Standard Time, which means the polls are still open in more than 25 states around the country, so you still have a chance to vote. If you are in Arizona, for example, where the states are still open for another hour, you have a chance to vote on whether or not to give the state legislature the right to set limits on hospitals or to set rate limits on hospital cost. If you're in Oregon, you have a chance to vote on whether or not the state should have a death penalty. We'll be back in just a moment.
One more state has closed its polls, Arkansas. Our projection is that Arkansas has gone to Ronald Reagan with its 6 electoral votes. Now, 280 for Mr. Reagan, 3 for Mondale, the 3 being from the District of Columbia. Now we're going to talk to Barry Serafin, who has been keeping track of the national trends as the votes have come in. Barry?
Keeping track of them at the moment you speak to him.
David and Peter, let's take a look at some of the basics. So far, President Reagan is winning among both men and women, very handily among men. His support stronger there, as it has been all along. He's taking about 2/3 of the vote among men, 62% to 37%. And 37% for Mr. Mondale. And among women, it's still Ronald Reagan, 58% to 42%. There's been so much talk about registration, and as you see, Mr. Reagan is also taking young voters and new voters. Among new voters, 61% to 39%. The president is winning among all age groups, not just the young. He's winning among all income groups so far, except the poorest, those making less than $5,000 a year. The strong leadership issue seems to be working for him. One issue not working against him is the president's age. Only 10% of the voters that we've been questioning say that's an issue with them or a concern to them. And that's actually a smaller number than 4 years ago when Mr. Reagan was 69.
Barry, can I ask you a question? You've been watching this stuff all year for us, with great excellence, I might add. Do you see any single surprise there this evening at all?
I really don't see any surprise so far, Peter. I do see some evidence in some states of Reagan coattails, which we may talk about a little later on tonight. There's been a lot of speculation about that, and I think we'll be able to point to some places where they exist.
Thank you very much. By the way, speaking of some place that doesn't need coattails, and some place that we have not yet projected because it really wasn't necessary if I can find it, in Louisiana, J. Bennett Johnson is staying in the Senate. He was unopposed because back in September 25th, I think it was, he won the primary in Louisiana with more than 25%. Now, the polls are still open in Louisiana, but J. Bennett Johnson, who is the senator
elected,
from there,
he was elected.
Was actually elected.
Right.
So
he's been elected, so it didn't
he
really
should be on somebody's board.
We could have projected that three months ago had we felt called on to do so. In fact, we did. So that election is settled. You know, there are no surprises, as Barry says, except in some of the upset races, such as the Senate in Kentucky. But this may not be a surprise because we saw it coming. But it is astonishing, nevertheless, to find that young people, 18 to 24 years old, college age and a little beyond, are voting very heavily for the Republicans. That's the exact opposite of our experience in the past.
And I have a projection. ABC News now projects that Mr. Reagan has won, or is the winner, in the state of Pennsylvania with its 25 electoral votes. That was one the Democrats really wanted very, very badly, a large Italian vote among other things. You can see now what that means in terms of electoral votes: 305 for Mr. Reagan, 3 for Walter Mondale, and we remind you that those 3 for Mr. Mondale have come in the District of Columbia. Joining us in... Sorry, David. Joining us in Washington now are the respective chairmen of the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, seen from left to right on your screen. Charles Manat, who is the chairman of the DNC, and Frank Fahrenkopf, who isn't looking as happy as Mr. Manat at the moment, that's better, who is the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Mr. Manat, let me start with you. As bad as you expected?
Well, I'm glad that you both projected Bennett Johnson, the winner in Louisiana. I thought you were holding back on him a little bit tonight. I think, you know, obviously the polls are still open on the West Coast and other areas. We have to see what develops in the other time zones and other states. It isn't all that encouraging, but we're trying to get out the vote and hanging in there.
Well, I know you're a Californian, Mr. Manat, and that's where you make your home. But that western part of the country is really traditional. Let's put California aside for a second. Is real bedrock country for Mr. Reagan. There are only 47 electoral votes in California. Give us a little more, a broader picture of what you think is going on.
Well, what we Democrats, of course, have been doing, as you know, these last 3 or 4 years is renewing the party, building certain infrastructure as far as trying to catch up, frankly, to what the Republicans did under Mr. Brock in the 70s and Mr. Fahrenkopf in the early part of the 80s. I think the Senate races, the House races tonight are going to give us encouragement. I'm obviously hopeful in the presidential race still. So we're hanging in there, and we want to get that maximum vote out all over the country.
Mr. Fahrenkopf, what do you think about that? Mr. Manat still hanging on, he says, and hoping to pull it out. What do you think?
Well, David, you know, Chuck and I, as the President, Mr. Mondale, have all agreed that no one is going to claim victory or give a concession speech until we were sure that all Americans, particularly those on the West Coast, have had an opportunity to exercise the franchise. As Chuck's from California, I'm from Nevada, and I have just as much interest to make sure that everyone gets out and votes on the West Coast. We're very heartened by what we've seen so far, particularly the fact that as we sit here now, it appears that we have a net pickup of 1 seat in the United States Senate. We picked up a couple of House seats in Kentucky, I'm sorry. And it looks like we've picked up a couple of House seats in Indiana. So from this perspective, early in the evening, while we're very pleased with what the President is doing, we're also very happy with what we see in the congressional races.
Mr. Fahrenkopf, going into this election tonight, a lot of Republicans were talking about a real realignment in the country, an absolutely historic shift of voters. Do you think that's what may be going on?
Oh, I don't think so, Peter. You know, I have been saying for some time that realignment comes in 2 waves. The first wave is a philosophical realignment, and I certainly believe that that's been going on for some time. I think that Watergate perhaps held us back a little bit, but certainly the election of the President in 1980 was the first sign that it was back, and I think this will be a reaffirming election vis-a-vis the welfare state and an opportunity society. But when you talk about the other realignment, that is party registration realignment and realignment from the standpoint of elected officials, I think we're seeing the start of that now, particularly with the young vote that you've seen. We're registering and did register more young people at almost a 2-to-1 odds than the Democrats did. That's the start, I think, of the sign that means in the next few elections we have an opportunity to become the majority party.
Mr. Fahrenkopf and Mr. Manat, we hope to talk to both of you perhaps later in the evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
The two of them are in their headquarters hotels in Washington where they're planning what they hope will be victory. They both expect to have or hope to have victory parties with balloons and so on. Peter, you got
we have another projection to make, David. In the state of Arkansas, ABC News now wants to project in the governor's race there that Bill Clinton, who was the incumbent Democrat, that little star on your screen there means he is the incumbent, is going to be elected as the governor of Arkansas. He's only 38 years old. He was a governor once before, then he was out of it, and now he comes back with another shot, and he defeats Woody Freeman, who's never run for elective office at this level before, and who, among other things, is a Vietnam veteran. David?
He, as you say, he was in, he got voted out, now he's back in. He was the youngest governor in the country, and I think maybe the first time it decided he wasn't quite old enough and he needed 2 years of seasoning.
He's only 38 now. It's amazing the number of people running around the country. It'd be worth looking at before the evening out, the age and how young candidates for all of these offices all the way across the country are. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. We want to remind you that despite the projections and despite the fact that ABC News has now projected President Reagan has enough votes to go over the top, what has he got now? 305 electoral votes. The polls are still open in over half the states around the country. For example, if you live, there's the electoral vote. Well, we're looking at that. If you live in Providence, Rhode Island, you still have some time left to go and vote on a local proposition which argues that there should be money spent to renovate your schools in Providence. Now, that's a very important matter to your children. If you live in Colorado, you can go out and vote in a proposition as to whether or not there should be gambling in Pueblo County. We remind you of things only to remind you that just because the president is piling up electoral votes around the country, this night is not by any means over.
There are even 4 initiatives across the country in which you can vote to cut your taxes, which is, I would say, worth doing if it can be worked.
Try to get those up for the next
yes.
half hour.
The thing the Democrats in Washington would love most of all is, the Republicans in Washington would love most of all, is to replace Tip O'Neill as Speaker of the House. They would have to win a whole lot of seats to do it. It seems unlikely. But Charles Gibson is covering that for us. Charlie, does that look possible?
David, I don't think so. That takes a switch of 50 votes in the House, and there is no sign so far, obviously, that that kind of a thing is going to happen. People complain that there is no mystery anymore on election night. Well, we've got some mystery. It's going to be the House of Representatives. No one knows really yet. And we are watching about 100 races very closely. No one knows really yet whether the president's coattails are extending well into House races. Now, we have some critical House races that we are able to call at this time. Only one switch so far. That is in the 8th District of Indiana, where Francis McCloskey has been defeated by a 27-year-old Richard McIntyre. But the Democrats really weren't terribly surprised by that. They were very worried about the 2nd District of Indiana, where Phil Sharp always has a tough race for re-election, and we are projecting, even though that shows it to be dead even, we are projecting that Phil Sharp is going to carry the district in, well, there's some switches. It declares that we have declared and projected that Sharp is going to carry the 2nd District in Indiana. And there is one other that we should mention. It's the 7th District of Virginia. It's an open race. The Democrats had some hopes for it, but Frenchie Slaughter, an old delegate from the state of Virginia, is now going to come to the Congress. There was some battle there because Slaughter had very strong feelings on the racial issue, and it was part of the massive resistance program in Virginia back in the past, but Slaughter is coming to the House from the 7th District of Virginia. That is the Culpeper and Winchester areas. But the point that needs to be made is that on the races that we are checking that are still cannot be called yet, we do find that the Democratic congressional candidates are running well ahead of Walter Mondale. The problem that the Democrats have is that Ronald Reagan is winning such overwhelming victories in so many states, up in the mid-60s in percentages, that it is very difficult for Democratic candidates to overcome that. It takes a massive amount of ticket splitting for the Democratic congressional candidates to overcome that. We find, as I say, that they're running ahead of Mondale, but as of yet, no indications whether the Reagan coattails are going to significantly change the composition of the House. Gentlemen?
Charlie, thank you. As you say, it's impossible at this hour to tell what the composition of the House is going to turn out to be. Now, I have a projection from North Carolina in the race for the Senate. Our projection is that Jesse Helms, the incumbent Republican senator, is re-elected in North Carolina. Here is the vote figure as we have it now. Helms with 55%, Hunt with 44%. Jesse Helms, Republican incumbent, re-elected in North Carolina. Here is a look at the winner.
This is my country.
To conservative admirers, Jesse Helms is a hero, a guru of the new right. Even according to the moral majority's Reverend Jerry Falwell, a national treasure. To his critics, he is a bigot and a dangerous meddler in foreign policy, too cozy with Latin American right-wing extremists, such as El Salvador's Roberto D'Aubuisson. The 63-year-old Helms, a former television commentator and two-term member of the Senate, has been an outspoken opponent of busing, a Martin Luther King holiday, and abortion, and an equally outspoken advocate of school prayer and defense spending.
The only way to prevent war is to be able to fight and win one. That's the way to halt communism.
Helms based his campaign primarily on months of television commercials attacking his challenger, Governor James Hunt.
Jim Hunt, a Mondale liberal.
By the end of September, Helms had already spent a record $13 million in his re-election effort. That spending and Helms' prominence within conservative ranks made his the most closely watched Senate race in the country, especially in view of speculation that he might be in a position to claim chairmanship of the prestigious Foreign Relations Committee, a prospect that has excited his fans and horrified his critics. Gentlemen?
Well, the Helms
Helms
victory in North Carolina certainly will please a lot of people beyond the boundaries of North Carolina.
And it's going to turn considerable attention out of the Senate race in Illinois, where the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Charles Percy, is in a very tough race with Congressman Paul Simon, who's the Democrat. ABC News now wishes to project the state of Maryland. At the presidential level, the state of Maryland for President Reagan. Now, that is normally a very strong Democratic state, Mr. Reagan getting 58% of the vote. That's one of only 6 states that went for Mr. Carter in 1980. Mr. Reagan did run ahead in the polls earlier this evening, or earlier in the campaign, I should say, but Mr. Mondale had hoped very much, as had the Democrats, that they would be able to hold the state of Maryland. ABC News projects it has gone to Mr. Reagan with 10 electoral votes. David?
I have a projection from West Virginia in the race for governor, and our projection is that Governor Jay Rockefeller, the Democrat, has been elected to the Senate. Jay Rockefeller, governor of West Virginia, Democrat, elected to the Senate with 56% of the vote. Now, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who has become something of a figure in this year's election, a good number of Democrats, in fact, have been running against him, even though he is not a candidate for anything. Mr. Falwell, thank you for coming in. Are you upset by the fact that you've been used as a sort of hobgoblin by the Democrats?
Oh, not at all. They've got to pick on somebody, and that got them off the president's back.
Well, are you happy with what you've seen so far tonight? I know you are.
Well, I'm a Baptist, and I'm not supposed to get excited like Pentecostals, but I'm getting very close to it. Very happy with it.
Good.
Mr. Falwell, let me ask you, the moral majority is now becoming sort of part of our national currency. What is your legislative agenda for a second Reagan term?
Well, it's not so much what my legislative agenda is. I think that now that the president has a mandate, I think you'll see some meaningful arms reductions, negotiations going on. And the Soviets know now they must deal with a very strong president. And in addition to that, I think you'll see some of the social issues becoming front burner items again. I feel that appointments to the High Court, and contrary to what Mr. Mondale said, I'll not make those appointments, the president will. But I believe that judging from the quality of Mrs. O'Connor, his only appointment thus far, we can trust the president to select candidates who will stand for the sanctity of human life, born and unborn, and who will stand up for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So I see so many good things up front. The Senate, he's going to retain control now from all the projections that seem to be in. No one expected Mr. McConnell to win in Kentucky. It looks like he will. And so in the House, I would suggest he'll pick up about 30 seats there, which is effective control. So it looks like the president can really do the things that he went to Washington to do 4 years ago.
30 seats, you say, in the House? Where'd you get that figure?
That's my guess, and I've agreed to eat a newspaper here if I'm wrong, so I hope I'm right.
Our exit polls are showing that 69% of people who describe themselves as born-again Christians are voting for the president. And you mentioned Mr. Mondale's charge that you'd have a veto on appointments to the Supreme Court. Surely you'd like to have a say about that, wouldn't you?
Well, you know, many of us worked on the platform with committees and subcommittees in Dallas and before that, and in Detroit 4 years ago. The platform for the Republican Party is an excellent one. It addresses the issue not only at the Supreme Court level, but all federal judge appointments are to be persons who are committed to the sanctity of human life, to the constitutional rights of the born and the unborn. So I feel the president, I think it's his platform. I think he's pleased with it. And I feel that in the next 4 years, Ronald Reagan is going to make the appointments. I've never been asked for a name. I don't have any names in mind. But I did work for Ronald Reagan, and I believe in him, as a great majority of the Americans in this country do. We helped register millions of voters the last 6 years through moral majority. And they're out at the polls today everywhere, voting. If snow was up to their hips, they would have gone, because they're committed to helping rebuild this country, and Ronald Reagan is a part of that.
Mr. Falwell, let me try to ask you if it's possible to stand back from your partisan position for a moment. Religion and politics got all mixed up in this election campaign. I wonder whether or not you think it will continue, and whether, if it does continue, it's a good thing.
Well, I think for 200 years, religion and politics really have been involved with each other in this country. Last Sunday, for example, Mr. Mondale spoke in a black church, and he spoke a political message. That didn't make many headlines. If Ronald Reagan had been at Thomas Road Baptist Church last Sunday in Lynchburg, it would have made front page everywhere. I think it's been totally blown out of proportions because conservative ministers for the first time are involved. We have 102,000 priests, rabbis, pastors involved with us in moral majority, 6.5 million active workers, and having a great growth. We're going to register 1 million voters in 1985. We will continue, to answer your question, we'll be in church lobbies and church lawns registering voters every year from now on, and come 88 we'll be much stronger than we are now. And what has happened is this: for the first time, political conservatives and religious conservatives have joined forces together, and we've both had to give a little bit, take a little bit, make some compromise, but we constitute a massive majority in this country, because this country is still built upon the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we're very happy and praise the Lord for what's happening tonight.
Mr. Falwell, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in and talking with us. We'll be back with more election numbers in a moment. We projected Alabama where the polls closed some time ago. What we did not report was that a candidate for office there running for Congress ran a commercial making fun of the fact that his opponent was losing some of his hair, which antagonized most of the men in the district who also were, which proves nothing except you don't have to be a genius to run for Congress.
Let's have a quick look, David, before we go away at the electoral vote. There you can see the electoral vote. Mr. Reagan has 315 electoral votes. Mr. Mondale has 3. A reminder, every school child in America always ends up learning it and forgetting it. An electoral vote, 1 for each senator and 1 for each congressman in every state. That's how you get the total. That is the national picture at 52 minutes past the hour. It is 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. It is 8 o'clock in the Midwest. ABC wishes to make the following projections. For president in the state of Louisiana, the 10 electoral votes ABC News projects will go for Mr. Reagan. He won it in 1980. He gets it this time. In Colorado, where the Midwest ends and the mountains begin, ABC projects Mr. Reagan will win Colorado, Gary Hart's home state, the Republican in every one of the last 4 elections. In Arizona, where the population shift has given Arizona an extra 1 electoral votes this year, ABC News projects Mr. Reagan. And in the state of Nebraska, typical of Mr. Reagan's strength in the Plains state, ABC News projects the 5 electoral votes will go to Mr. Reagan.
And we have more projections. New Mexico, also for Mr. Reagan. 5 electoral votes in New Mexico. In North Dakota, Ronald Reagan, 3 electoral votes. South Dakota, Ronald Reagan, 3 electoral votes by our projections. And in Wyoming, Ronald Reagan, 3 electoral votes. So up to this hour, it is a clean sweep of every state so far for President Reagan, with 3 electoral votes for Walter Mondale in the District of Columbia.
Exactly.
Live from New York and around the nation, ABC News coverage of the 84 vote continues. Here now, David Brinkley and Peter Jennings.
We have a couple of more projections to make. The first one is in Rhode Island, I think, isn't it, David?
Claiborne Pell, the incumbent senator, is running for another term, the 5th term, I think, which would give him 30 years in the Senate. Apparently he plans to make a career of it. And in Colorado, the incumbent Senator Armstrong. We project Bill Armstrong. We project he has been elected for a 2nd term, the incumbent Republican senator in Colorado.
He was running there against Lieutenant Governor Nancy Dick, who is, we've been pointing out a little bit this evening, is one of 10 women who is running for the Senate this evening. We may have misled people a little earlier. Okay, where you go.
Another projection in Minnesota. Rudy Boschwitz, the Republican senator, re-elected in Minnesota. Rudy Boschwitz, Republican, re-elected by our projection.
Running for his 2nd term, and he was running against Joan Grow, the Democrat there, who was a teacher. Rudy Boschwitz win. We also have a projection to make in the state of New Mexico, where Pete Domenici, the incumbent Democrat, or I should say the incumbent Republican, we project will regain his seat running for a third term in New Mexico for the Senate. He is, of course, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. Here's another one. In South Dakota, ABC News projects that Larry Pressler, the Republican incumbent, will win his seat again in South Dakota. Coming fast and furious here. Why don't you just stand up here and give them to us? Thank you very much
All right,
indeed.
now Wyoming. In Wyoming, we projected Republican incumbent Senator Alan Simpson re-elected. That's a Simpson of the Simpson-Mazzoli immigration bill, which didn't quite pass.
And in the state of Arkansas, where David Pryor, who is the incumbent Democrat, keeps a sign on his desk saying Arkansas comes first, that's the sign he keeps on his desk in Washington, we project that David Pryor, the incumbent Democrat in the state of Arkansas, is going to be returned, having defeated Congressman Ed Bethune, who is the Republican there. Whew.
Now, one of the, for a time earlier, it looked as if Governor Rockefeller of West Virginia was in a bit of trouble in his race for the Senate, but apparently now he's pulled it out, and we have projected him an hour or so ago as the winner. Why it was, and it was a close race. Why? All kinds of reasons.
Well, he had two terms as governor, David, and I guess that creates a lot of negative things. The state had lost some industry, and that didn't make him altogether too popular. And a lot of the labor unions in West Virginia were not altogether happy with their Democratic candidate, and I think didn't work as hard, or at least diluted the effect they may have had on the race. That's what it's looking like in the Senate race in West Virginia now, with 9% of the precincts reporting with Jay Rockefeller having 55% to 45%. That, as you said earlier, is not the way the closing polls, the closing pre-election polls were like by any means.
A lot of people in West Virginia, I think, have resented the fact that he has spent tremendous, tons of money to be first elected governor and now to be elected senator. Senator Thurmond of South Carolina came into the state to campaign against it, and he said spending of that size was, as he put it, almost corrupting. Rockefeller responded it was all legal, all proper, and it certainly is legal.
ABC News now also wants to make another presidential projection. In the state of West Virginia, ABC News projects that Mr. Reagan will pick up the 6 electoral votes there. Again, that's one of the only of the 6 states that went for Mr. Carter in 1980, normally a strong Democratic state, but the pre-election polls did show Mr. Reagan ahead, even though Walter Mondale and the Democrats had hoped they would do well in West Virginia. West Virginia, 6 electoral votes for Mr. Reagan.
Peter, I'd like to point out to our viewers this map over our shoulders here and explain what it is. The red states are states that we have projected having gone for Mr. Reagan. Red R. Reagan. That's why we chose red. The white states we have not yet projected either because their polls have not closed, as in the case of the western states, or in some not in the West, they're too close to call at this hour. As you see, there's New York, Massachusetts still out.
Pennsylvania was too close to call for a while, but it's now gone.
The blue dot on the top of the state of Virginia is the District of Columbia, which is the one area Walter Mondale has carried tonight. As you see, except for that, the map is all of those states we've projected. The map is entirely, totally red for Reagan.
Now, in just a minute, we are going to talk to a man who has seen a lot of time on the campaign trail this year, and it will be interesting to hear what he has to say about tonight. Senator Gary Hart of Colorado will join us right after this.
Here is a projection that will be particularly distressing to the Mondale campaign. We project that the state of Massachusetts has gone for Ronald Reagan. Massachusetts, President Reagan, 13 electoral votes. Mr. Reagan barely carried, with a fraction of 1%, barely carried Massachusetts 4 years ago. And prior to that, as you will recall, when Nixon got his huge landslide, it was the only state that went for George McGovern. We have another projection in Rhode Island, where there is no incumbent, or there is, but he is retiring and not running again. The winner is Edward DePrette, a Republican governor elected in Rhode Island. Is that DePrette or DePrete?
It's DePrete, I think, actually, David, in Rhode Island, and that, as you said, was an open seat. Speaking of Massachusetts and McGovern, we're going to talk in a moment to Senator Gary Hart, but before we do, you're seeing the presidential vote pile up. All you have to do is take a look at that map based on our projections. But something else that is really shaping up this evening is a really very big battle for the House of Representatives particularly, and so in many parts of the Midwest and of course in the West, where the polls are still open, your vote is going to count. And for example, we talked a lot earlier this evening about those propositions. If you live in Des Moines, there is still almost an hour left for you to vote on whether or not the city library should spend more than $2 billion to buy computers for the libraries. If you happen to live in the state of Washington, there is a very important proposition on the ballot up there as to whether or not the state should be prohibited from paying for abortions. So we offer this to you as a reminder in those parts of the country where the polls have not yet closed, that you have an opportunity to affect some very significant things in your and your fellow citizens' lives. Now joining us from, to be perfectly honest, somewhere in Colorado, I'm not altogether sure where, Senator Gary Hart, who you will recall through much of the primary campaign was Walter Mondale's primary opponent. Senator Hart, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you first whether or not you think that any Democrat this year could have beaten Ronald Reagan.
Well, I think that's, first of all, a hypothetical question that we'll never know the answer to. I think, first of all, we have to congratulate the President on his showing, but I also want to say a word on Fritz Mondale's behalf. He waged a decent and courageous campaign. I was with him earlier this year, this fall, when he decided to try to win the presidency. He could have opted to try to carry the Democratic states and lose respectably, if you will. But he wanted to win, and I thought it was the right choice at the time, and I think it says volumes about him.
I don't think a great many people would disagree with you on Mr. Mondale's grace in adversity, Senator, particularly in the waning days of the campaign. Would you like to take another run at that question as to whether or not you think anybody might have done better? You used to say that you'd do better.
No, I don't. I don't want to take a run at it.
You don't want to take a run at it?
No, I think it's hypothetical, and it doesn't serve any particular purpose now to try to speculate as to what might have happened under different circumstances. I think Fritz Mondale waged a tremendously courageous campaign, and my hat is off to him.
Senator, we have some figures here from exit polling during the day that we find interesting, and I think maybe you will. It shows what those who voted for you during the primaries did today. And what it shows is that 71% of those who voted for you in the primaries voted for Mondale. 29% of them voted for Reagan. Does that surprise you?
I think, Mr. Brinkley, when the dust settles and all the figures are in, that a much higher percentage of Hart supporters across the country will have voted for Walter Mondale. I think 70% is good. I think it'll be well above 80 or more percent. Fundamentally, I disagree with Ronald Reagan on virtually all the issues, and I can't really see a lot of people who voted for me crossing over and voting for Ronald Reagan.
Senator, very early in the campaign, you were very determined to tell the Democratic Party that you were the person of the future for the party, that it was going down the wrong road. If this continues all the way across the country, but even based on what you see now, what's the message for the Democratic Party?
Well, first of all, a lot of new Democrats are winning election and re-election in the Senate and the House and other races. The leadership of our party rests with the generation elected in the 70s, and I think that generation is both progressive as well as rooted in the traditional values and principles of the Democratic Party. I think the future of our party is extremely bright, frankly. I discount or disagree with the theory that this is some sort of a realignment or a massive shift of the center in this country to the Reagan right.
Senator, I apologize. Can I interrupt you for just 1 second, because we'd like you to go on, but we want to make an important projection. ABC News now projects that Mr. Reagan has won in the state of New York, which, among other things, is the home state of Geraldine Ferraro. The Democrats had hoped very much that Ms. Ferraro would help in the state of New York. ABC News projects that Mr. Reagan will win in the state of New York with its 36 electoral votes. That is the second largest number of electoral votes in the country, second only to California. Senator, what do you think about that?
Well, that's unfortunate. Clearly, the Democrats would love to have carried that state. It's a traditionally Democratic state. I believe we will come back. We have a very strong and popular Democratic governor there, Governor Cuomo and Senator Moynihan and others. That is going to continue to be a Democratic state in the 80s and 90s.
Well, Senator, this must be a bit distressing. During the primaries, you seem to have a particular appeal for younger people. We find today, and in fact our polls have been showing it for some time, that young people of 18 to 24 years are voting very heavily for Mr. Reagan. What do you make of that?
Well, it's too bad. We have to get those voters back. They ought to be Democratic across the board on virtually all the issues, whether environmental quality, increased attention to education, job opportunities, foreign policy that's based on diplomacy, reining in the arms race and not expanding it. They agree with our party and our leaders. We have to put people forward, and we will put people forward who appeal to those voters. And I think you're going to see in the future that the younger voters will be coming back to the Democratic Party.
Senator, thank you. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We have been dealing with numbers for a great deal of this evening. Let's try to deal for a moment now with the two personalities who carried their party's banners in this flags. I suspect that Sam Donaldson, who's been with President Reagan, and Britt Hume has been with Mr. Mondale, know their candidates just as well as anybody. We'd like to hear from both of them as to what they think their candidates may be thinking. Sam, may we begin with you?
Well, Peter, everyone's happy here at the Reagan headquarters in Los Angeles at the Century Plaza Hotel, but it's not a great euphoric scene. People aren't running up and down the corridors slapping each other on the back, just sort of a sense of quiet satisfaction. A few minutes ago, reporters and photographers went upstairs to see the President and Mrs. Reagan and ask him a few questions. We asked him, for instance, what he would do with this very broad and deep mandate which he's won tonight.
We're going to carry on the program that we started 4 years ago. A company with economic growth without inflation, strong defense, every effort we can make to get arms reductions.
Well, to what extent do you think you can do something new to get the Soviets to resume negotiations?
Well, everybody keeps asking, why, what are we going to do? They're the ones who walked away from the table. What are they going to do?
Do you expect big shake-ups, sir? You're going to change the cabinet? A lot of new faces?
No. I know that always.
At the end of that interview, we asked him what he had to say to Walter Mondale, because although Mr. Reagan has never lost an election, he certainly lost primaries, and he lost the nomination in 1976. Well, he replied that he didn't think there was anything he could say that would make Mondale feel any better. But he said he wanted to reach out and sort of unify the country and reach out toward people who had not supported him in this election. So you get the sense that Ronald Reagan is not going to rub anyone's nose in it because of this huge landslide that he's getting, but instead is going to attempt to get everybody back into the fold so that he can try to push forward with that mandate he thinks he has. Gentlemen?
Sam, thank you. Now we're going to Britt Hume, who is in Minnesota with the Mondale campaign. And I understand he has a response to what Mr. Reagan has been saying. Britt?
Well, David, Mondale at the moment is ensconced in a hotel suite just a couple of blocks from the St. Paul Civic Center, which is where I'm standing now. There's kind of a noisy rock band playing behind me before a small milling crowd. It is relatively early still out here in Minnesota, but everybody's watching television and they know what's going on, and obviously Mr. Mondale does too. Earlier this evening, he spoke to a dinner of his staff. An estimated 500 or more people gathered in a private room at another hotel, and he is said to have told them that he knew that they had done what they did for him this year for the good of the country, and also said to have told them that they will remember this year as one in which they learned more than they ever have before in their adult life. He was apparently wildly cheered and applauded, and there were some tears. I gather if this trend continues tonight, there will be some more cheers before it is over. He is not expected to come here to be heard in any way before the polls close in California, which is just under 2 hours from now. From what we have seen of Mr. Mondale today, although he obviously knew such a thing was possible, as seems to be unfolding here tonight, he has again today managed to maintain good spirits and seems to have done so as well tonight.
Britt, I want to ask you a question. A lot of people have remarked tonight on how graceful Mr. Mondale and how determined he's been in the days when the polls were running against him. When he was going around brandishing the newspaper from 48 about Dewey defeating Truman, how much of it did he believe and how much of it was to keep the spirits up for the troops?
I think it was largely to keep the spirits up for the troops, Peter. He knew in the aftermath of the second debate, when he sat down with his aides about 3 days later, and they went over all the polls, their own and everybody else's that were then available, and found that the consensus of the polls was, indeed the unanimous view of the polls was, that he had either not gained any ground or that he had begun to lose ground again to Mr. Reagan, that they really didn't have any other turning point that they could look toward for victory. So he has known for some time that this was not a good situation, not one which promised victory, and he put on this burst, I think, for the party and for his own pride.
Britt, thanks very much indeed.
Peter, I have a projection from New Hampshire in the election of or re-election of a senator. The projection is that Gordon Humphrey, the incumbent Republican, an airline pilot, conservative, has been re-elected to a second term in New Hampshire. There are the figures. We'll be back with more in a moment.
.30 in the east, 8:30 in the west. The polls are beginning to close through the Midwest and the mountain states now and out into the west. Let us take a look at what the popular vote is showing at the moment. 18% of the precincts, that's a national figure you're looking at, with 18% of the popular vote showing Mr. Reagan is getting about 60% of it, a little more than 10 million votes. Mr. Mondale is getting just under 7 million votes. Our preliminary indications are that the turnout throughout the country is fairly light, up slightly in the Northeast, but down slightly in the South and in the Midwest, and of course the West itself is yet to be heard from. Somebody for us to hear from. We're joined in our election headquarters now by Dr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, former National Security Advisor to President Reagan. What's a Reagan foreign policy going to look like in a second term? Same as the first term?
I don't want President Reagan to have a heart attack. I was not Security Advisor to President Reagan.
I beg your pardon, President Nixon, you're quite right.
I think that now the conditions exist for a really successful 4 years of foreign policy. The groundwork has been laid with this overwhelming mandate, and with the Soviet Union having the difficulties that it does, I believe that we will be in a very good position to negotiate, and I don't see any other area of the world that is likely to explode on us.
What difficulties particularly you refer to in the Soviet Union?
Well, the Soviets have two problems. One, they have an institutional problem in their succession crisis, not just in the top position, but in the fact that two-thirds of their Politburo is approaching 80. Secondly, their economy is in terrible shape. Thirdly, we see in countries like Poland that they have the almost inexplicable developments with the security people killing a priest and then the government turning on the security people, which has never happened in a communist state. So I think that the Soviets will be under pressure to negotiate. The biggest problem may be that the Soviet leadership may be so divided that they may not know how to negotiate, even though they have decided to do it.
It is often said, Dr. Kissinger, that in Washington there has been no resolution as to whether or not yet to negotiate an arms control.
Well, I have the impression that the president has decided to negotiate. I also have the impression that there are differences of opinion between the various departments, and also the technology has evolved so fast that the traditional views that have existed have to be changed. So there's no doubt that a lot of homework has to be done within our government, and I would think within our body politic, to find some bipartisan basis on which to proceed.
Mr. Reagan is will be our first president to be elected twice since Eisenhower, if he serves out the term. Will he be eager to use his last term, legally his last term, to create a monument to himself in bringing peace with the Soviet Union? Well, and if so, will he be excessively eager to negotiate? Your judgment.
One would tend to think that the only election that President Reagan has left to run for is the vote of history, and that will want him to leave some landmark which is usually associated with the role of the peacemaker. There is a danger that peace will get identified with a sort of atmospheric condition and not with the resolution of specific issues which have produced the tensions in the first place.
Let me raise a question.
I think that's a bigger danger than that he will be too tough.
Let me raise a question about a specific area. I got you in the wrong job there for a moment, but you have worked with the administration on the Central America Commission. Do you see the administration pursuing the same policy of pressure against Nicaragua and Central America?
Well, I think the administration has more or less adopted the recommendations of that bipartisan commission, which involve economic development and military assistance and negotiation coupled with pressure on Nicaragua, but in a framework in which all the nations there that are willing to have a democratic future will cooperate. I think that, in fact, in Salvador, the situation has improved. In Nicaragua, we have, I would think, between now and next summer to see whether we can score a breakthrough.
Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much for joining us. David has a projection.
I do, from Wisconsin. In the presidential race, we project, ABC News projects, that Wisconsin has gone to Mr. Reagan. Wisconsin is a neighboring state of Minnesota, Mr. Mondale's home state. Seems not to have helped him much. Ronald Reagan has won the 11 electoral votes in Wisconsin, and here are the figures as they stand at this time. Now, we're going to talk to Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who ran on his own, 1964, and lost, and ask him what he thinks about all of this when we return in a moment.
It is 10 o'clock in the East, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, 7 o'clock on the Pacific. ABC News now projects that Ronald Reagan has won the 5 electoral votes in the state of Utah, the state that has given the Republicans their largest margins in 1976 and 80. ABC News projects Mr. Reagan in the state of Nevada with its 4 electoral votes. And we also project that Mr. Reagan has won, no surprise, the state of Montana, part of Mr. Reagan's western political fortress.
And we have still more projections. In Iowa, we project that Ronald Reagan has won the state in its 8 electoral votes. In Idaho, which he carried with 66% of the vote in 1980, in Idaho, we project that Mr. Reagan has again won the state and its 4 electoral votes. Here's the electoral total as it stands now. It is an all so far. Many states are still open, still voting. So far, it is almost a totally clean sweep for Reagan. The 3 for Mondale from the District of Columbia.
This is ABC News coverage of the 84 vote. From ABC News election headquarters in New York, David Brinkley and Peter Jennings.
Welcome back. As we said, it is 10 o'clock here in the East, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, 7 o'clock in the Pacific. A number of states have still got polls open. Lots of things for you to vote on there, including the presidential race. We were talking in the last half hour about the state of Minnesota. We have not projected a presidential winner in the state of Minnesota. Mr. Mondale, at the moment, has a very slight lead, but we are, quite frankly, with 2% of the precincts coming in, saying that is presently too close to call, even though in that popular vote it looks like more than a slight lead, 57% to 43%. David?
Now, Mr. Reagan, no doubt, was very happy with his electoral vote, and no doubt very happy with the fact he has been reelected by a substantial margin, but he must be extremely concerned, any president must be, about the makeup of the House of Representatives, which is now dominated by the Democrats, and Mr. Reagan looks forward to some improvement in the House. How much he will get, we don't know yet. Charlie Gibson, who covers it all the time, is there. Charlie, what do you see happening? How much can you tell at this hour?
Well, you can't tell anything definitive, but I was interested to hear Jack Kemp say in your last half hour that he now expects more than a 20-seat pickup for the Republicans in the House, and I think it's too early to say that. We have an overwhelming Reagan victory in so many states, but as of now, we only show a pickup by the Republicans of 5 seats. There are plenty of districts to go, but at the moment, only 5-seat pickup, and there are a couple of notable ones we should mention. In the 11th District of New Jersey, Dean Gallo has defeated a 22-year veteran of the House, Joe Minish. Joe Minish really got redistricted into a bad area, and he has lost rather heavily. That is one of the pickups for the Republicans. Another one in the 5th District of Connecticut, where Bill Ratchford, a very popular Democrat around here, has lost to a very young man, Jim Rowland, from a long political family in the state of Connecticut. But there are a couple of other pickups. David mentioned earlier that Bob Smith race in New Hampshire, Dudley has lost in that race. Smith has won it, and in North Carolina, William Colby, the former athletic director in North Carolina, has won against a Democrat. But there are a number of seats that we've been watching that the the Democrats are holding, seats that the Republicans had hoped to pick up. In Virginia 6, for instance, the Republicans had high hopes for this one. The Democrats have held it. Also in the at-large seat in Delaware, the Republicans had hopes with Elise DuPont running. You don't bet against a DuPont in Delaware, but nonetheless a DuPont there has lost to Carper. In Ohio 9, again, the Republicans had some hopes. They didn't win there. And one more that we should mention is in Connecticut 3. where the Republicans with Larry DeNardis had hoped to beat Bruce Morrison and they did not. The point being here, the Republicans, yes, are making gains, but no, they are not making the gains of the size they had hoped. There are plenty of other critical states that we're watching, North Carolina, Texas, etc. As I say, presently a pickup of 5 for the Republicans. And there will be more, but whether they get over that 20 level that Jack Kemp mentioned, it is questionable at this time. Gentlemen?
Charlie, I don't want to throw any man a curve who's got to keep his hands on 435 races, but there is a race in Massachusetts, Illinois, and Idaho where congressmen who were censured by their colleagues are running for re-election. Can you tell me how they're doing?
Too early to call. In the 10th District of Massachusetts, Gary Studs, who was censured by the House for a homosexual relationship with a page 11 years ago, he is leading. Too early to call on the Illinois race or the Hansen race in Idaho. We'll let you know.
Doesn't like I threw him a curve. It looks like I set him up.
No, it looks as if you had rehearsed that.
Thanks.
Charlie, I congratulate you. 435 races, and he has them all at his fingertips. It's
We'll be
pretty
back.
good.
We'll be back in just a moment.
This portion of the 84 vote is being brought to you by Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers and Manufacturers Hanover, the financial source worldwide. ABC News coverage of the 84 vote continues.
Good evening again. ABC News now has a projection to make in the Idaho Senate race, where we are projecting that Jim McClure, who is the Republican incumbent, has defeated his opponent Pete Bush, who was making his first try for elective office. ABC projecting Jim McClure, the incumbent Republican, in the Senate. It may be a small thing, David, but it's the small things that help. Jim McClure very much pleased his rural constituents this year. He got $440,000 to fight grasshopper infestation just towards the end of the last session of Congress.
Well, he also was a friend of and often an admirer of James Watt, stuck with him through thin and thin. Now, there are 10 women running for the Senate this year. One of them, we have already projected her as a winner, is Nancy Kassebaum, Republican of Kansas, who is standing by at this moment. Is that your headquarters there, Ms. Kassebaum? You in your headquarters there? The green?
No, I'm at the Mid-America Indian Center in Wichita.
All right. Well, wherever it is, we're happy to have you with us. Let me ask you, and you should be an authority on this subject. Was Ms. Ferraro on the Democratic ticket a hurt or a help? Politically, I mean, not philosophically. What do you think?
Well, I think it's too early to assess just exactly what impact she had. I would have to guess from comments I've heard that perhaps it's believed she has not been that much of an asset to the ticket. I frankly feel she ran a very hard and tough campaign and certainly did break a barrier.
Well, Senator, if you don't think she really did help, and you're a successful politician, one of not many women in the Senate, one of 2, why do you think she didn't help?
I think it was a combination of factors for the Democratic ticket, and I think that the Mondale-Ferraro combination just was not one that was going to draw, and particularly where Mr. Mondale needed the South, it was just not an area that she seemed to be able to draw support from.
We kept hearing people say that Ms. Ferraro was a very attractive woman and very competent, and it's too bad she wasn't running with Ronald Reagan. I assume you would agree with that?
Well,
George Bush is not going to be upset, so...
Well, I just don't know how you would weigh that out. Obviously, I think President Reagan was going to be elected no matter who was with him.
Well, from the returns we have so far, which I trust you have seen, he has made a clean sweep of every state that has at this hour closed its polls and which we have been able to project. And he's far ahead. Thank you very much, Ms. Kassebaum. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. ABC's Barry Sarafin keeps his hands on all our exit polls throughout the evening, and we were just noting a little while ago that at the moment, this is not a definitive final answer by any means, but at the moment, President Reagan is leading in Geraldine Ferraro's home district of Queens in New York City. So let us go to Barry Sarafin now and see what the women's vote and the vote for and or against women shapes up like tonight. Barry?
Well, Peter, first of all, the president continues to lead among both men and women tonight. Among men, 62% to 37%. Among women, 55% to 45%, a little less enthusiastic support among women. And in one state tonight, Geraldine Ferraro's home state of New York, there was a genuine gender gap. In this state, it was the president favored by men 56 to 44%, 43. And among women, however, they went for Walter Mondale, 55% to 45. In this state, the choice of a vice presidential candidate was deemed important by a number of voters. Nearly half of them said so, and among those voters, they favored Walter Mondale, 54% to 46. Even so, among Italians in New York, it was Ronald Reagan by more than 20 points. And among Catholic voters, and they were a huge part, nearly half of the electorate in New York, it was again Mr. Reagan favored by a big majority. We should point out that across the country so far, only 14% of the women that we've questioned say the choice of a woman as the vice presidential candidate was important in casting their vote today. Gentlemen?
Barry, thank you. I have a projection, one we have all been waiting for with some interest and curiosity. It is from Minnesota. We project that in Minnesota, Walter Mondale has won his home state, and the first state he has won this evening. It's fairly close. It should be remembered, by the way, that Mondale has not actually lived in Minnesota for about 20 years. He's lived in Washington. But nevertheless, it's his home state. He grew up there. And there you see the first blue state on the ABC News map. Minnesota for Mondale. Only 3 states on the mainland of the U.S., 48 states, left white because we haven't been able to project them yet because they're still voting. Peter?
You know, I was wondering, Barry, David, Barry Sarfin was telling us a little while ago that a great many people had made up their minds how they were going to vote long before tonight. Very different than it was in the primary campaigns. And as you were talking, I kept thinking about Walter Mondale's return to that giant rally he had in Minnesota the other day when somebody, I think, put on a Minnesota North Stars hockey shirt on him. He made a very emotional speech, not only to his staff, but to the people of the state, which created, at least on television, where so much of the campaign has been this year, a real sense of belonging in that state. I'm not sure what that vote reflects tonight, but it certainly is going to make him feel better than he must be feeling in terms of the total evening.
Well, yes. Otherwise, he may not have won a single state. And losing his own home state, as I say, even though he hasn't lived there in a long time, would certainly be embarrassing, as well as having other negative aspects.
You know, this coverage on our network, at least tonight, is being seen obviously around the country, but it's also being seen in various places overseas. At the American Embassy in London, for example, they're watching election coverage here, as people do, and stream in many overseas capitals. Every election night down, Americans as well as people who live in the countries themselves. And we often forget that when we elect a president of the United States, we're electing a president of the free world. And overseas people watch this vote just as closely and sometimes more closely than people in this country do. We want to go to London now, where ABC's Barry Dunsmore is standing by in our London bureau. Barry, let me ask you first. I see you're there with David Owen, who is a former Foreign Secretary. What the reaction is there and what Dr. Owen has to say.
Well, first of all, Peter, I think it is no surprise to the people in London that this has happened, but I will leave it to Dr. Owen to give us his thoughts on what it means to the British and perhaps the Europeans as well.
Well, we've expected it. There are no surprises. I think for most of us, we think this election has shifted the president's attitude to arms control and to the Soviet Union, and for all of us, for the better. Certainly since January, he's been speaking a language which we found much easier to live with, those of us who are firm supporters of NATO and strong on multilateral disarmament. What we hope now is he'll live up to it in his second term, that he'll carry a serious dialogue, a constructive dialogue with the Soviet Union. I think he'll get a response. I think Gromyko visiting him in the election was important. That's the way we'll judge him, above all on the question of peace and whether he'll really live up to his electoral rhetoric.
Isn't there a fear, however, that indeed that was simply rhetoric? And I've heard you speak in other fora where you've suggested that there are certain dangers to this great landslide.
Well, yes. On the other hand, I personally think he will stick to it. I'm sticking my neck out. I think 86 we'll see some form of agreement. It's vitally important for us in Europe, but I think it's even more important for his own presidency. Second-term presidents look at the history books. And the way he will go down the history books is has he delivered a peace? I think that is the fundamental issue. We also worry about the deficit and how you handle that deficit. And I personally think the least damaging way of handling the deficit for your economy and for the world economy, and particularly the third world with the debt problem, is if you are prepared to slow down the increase in your defense budget. Now, you're not going to do that unless you're into a serious dialogue and feeling reasonably optimistic of making progress with the Soviet Union. So you come back all the time to the question of an ordered relationship with the Soviet Union. That's what's been missing. It's been missing now ever since really Nixon left office. And the Europeans want to see the Soviet Union and the United States. We know you won't like each other. We don't expect you to. I don't want to either. What I want you to do is to have a relationship which has no risk attached to it, where the Soviets understand you and you understand the Soviet Union. And that's the real test for President Reagan. In the first 3 years of his administration, he was the recruiting sergeant for the unilateralists here in Europe, and I hope that will change now.
Dr. David Owen, thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Dr. Owen. I must say I'm pleased. I've many times tried to get Dr. Owen up at 3:15 in the morning, which it is now, and you succeeded. You succeeded, Barry, where I failed.
Do you blame me?
We want to, in just a minute, go across the English Channel and talk to Pierre Salinger in France, but we have a projection first to make that in the state of Iowa, we wish to make a projection in the Senate race where Tom Harkin, the Democrat, has upset Roger Jepsen, the incumbent. Now, that is a big upset in the state of Iowa for the Republican incumbent, Roger Jepsen. That was something that has been showing slightly in the polls before Election Day. They had very much of a neck-and-neck race, but that is a big setback for the Iowans. Though, if I recall, Iowans haven't sent an incumbent back to Washington in some years. Am I right?
They seem to have an unofficial 6-year rule. You serve 6 years and you're out. Not a bad rule, in my opinion.
Not too keen on Washington. Right. We'll be back in just a moment. We want to make a projection now in the Nebraska Senate race, where ABC News now projects that the incumbent Democrat, James Exon, has defeated his opponent, Nancy Hawk. James Exon, who is a former popular governor. Nancy Hawk was one of the 10 women running for the Senate tonight. She is a member of the University of Nebraska Board of Regents. There is no change there. James Exon, the incumbent, returned to the Senate by our projection. David,
now we have two projections from 2 states for governors in the governor's elections. First in Montana. I think I have it right. Is Montana first? Yes.
Yep.
We project the election of Ted Schwinden, who is the incumbent, re-election, who is a Democrat, governor of Montana. And in Utah, Norman Bangerter. He is a state representative, a Republican, and we project him to be the winner in the race for governor in Utah.
That is an open race there, so that is a gain for the Republicans because, as I recall, Governor Matheson is retiring or could not succeed himself. I think he decided to retire, and so that is a gain for the Republicans there.
He's been governor quite a long time, and he didn't have to retire. In the West, they're not so tough about saying a governor can only have 1 term or 2 terms. That happened in the East when they were still trying to punish King George III by limiting our governors to 1 term or 2 terms. Anyway, we're not going to Paris, I gather, because something is not working, but we will try it again shortly.
Can we take a quick look, just a very quick look at the popular vote board? 30% of the national vote is now reported in from around the country, and Mr. Reagan is getting about 59% of it, a little more than almost 16.5 million votes. Mr. Mondale getting 11.5 million votes, 41% of the vote, with 30% of the precincts reporting in from around the country.
We will go to Paris in about 10 minutes, I'm told. Just after 10:30 Eastern Time, we'll hear from Pierre Salinger and whatever he has to say about the French reaction to the American election.
It is perfectly true what I said. I mean, it's going on at the British Embassy and others, but all over the rest of the world, people follow these election results as closely as we do. I've had to follow them from some of the strangest places in the world, and they're not very hard to get because the Voice of America and other things pushes them up. At any rate, that is our national election picture at 22 minutes past the hour.
WKRN, Nashville.
ABC News coverage of the 84 vote continues. From ABC News election headquarters in New York, David Brinkley and Peter Jennings.
Welcome back. It is 10:30 in the East. It is 7:30 on the West Coast. We have a projection to make in the Montana Senate. Max Baucus, who is the incumbent Democrat, according to our projections, has defeated Chuck Cousins. Max Baucus, who is one of those people who walked across much of his state soliciting votes, was called by his opponent Charles Cousins a wimp. It didn't appear to work. We also want to remind you that out on the West Coast, you still have ample time to vote out there. It's only 7:30 in California, Oregon, and Washington State. There are still a lot of local races, and there are still some propositions. If you're in California, for example, you have an opportunity to go and vote on a proposition which would strengthen the famous Proposition 13 by further reducing property taxes. You also have an opportunity in California to vote on a proposition as to whether or not the state should issue a $50 million bond to fund centers for senior citizens. So your vote in California is still very important.
They have a chance to vote against Howard Jarvis or for him. Either way.
That's absolutely perfectly correct, the creator of Proposition 13. We now want to go, before he, in all fairness, falls asleep at the wheel, to Pierre Salinger in Paris, where it is, what, Pierre, almost 4 o'clock in the morning. We've talked to Britain, and we'd like to know what your reading is from France at this point.
Well, Peter, I'm at the Paris Opera, where tonight there was a glittering party around the American election sponsored by the French magazine Paris Match. They had what you call the Tout Paris, actors, politicians, and when it was announced here that Ronald Reagan had won, a wave of applause went through the crowd. Then everybody went home and went to bed, and I stayed here waiting for you. But the applause was totally linked to a poll which was published in the French newspaper Le Monde today, and which showed if the French could have voted in the American election, they would have voted for Ronald Reagan. However, they also said that while they would have voted for Ronald Reagan, they did not want Reaganomics applied to France. One of the most interesting aspects of that poll is the rise in the number of French who believe that the United States would now come to the aid of Europe that was invaded by the Soviet Union since Ronald Reagan came to power. That figure has gone up dramatically in France, and I think it's probably one of the accomplishments that Ronald Reagan has had overseas.
Pierre, is that why they say they would vote for him? Were they able to vote because of that?
Yes, I think that's the principal theme, because if you analyze the poll, you see that they're opposed to our policies in Central America. They're opposed to our policies in the Middle East. They're even on the idea of the deployment of missiles, but they are strongly in favor of Ronald Reagan's policies vis-a-vis the Soviet Union.
Pierre, you've just come back from India and the funeral of Mrs. Gandhi. And one of the concerns that Mrs. Gandhi expressed just before she died was about superpower confrontation and competition on the subcontinent. Did you get any sense while you were in New Delhi of how the Indians and the Pakistanis might feel about a second Reagan term?
Well, I did, really, to be honest with you, I did not get into much of Ronald Reagan while I was in India. You know that Mrs. Gandhi had kind of tilted her government in the last 2 years toward the Soviet Union and against the United States. She was not on very friendly terms with the United States. And one of the questions that's being posed now is that whether Rajiv Gandhi is going to change that tilt now that he's in power.
Pierre, thank you very much for joining us. Hate to keep you up so late, but much more important in your case, hate to make you miss a party. Thanks very much for joining us.
If he didn't miss one at the Paris Opera, it looks quite beautiful.
I think he's been standing upstairs, though, while it's all been going on downstairs.
Let's see. We have some races that have not yet been called, and for two reasons. One, they're too close to call. We can't tell yet who won. And the other reason is that some of the polls in the West are still open. We do have now a projection from North Dakota in the race for governor. And our projection is that State Representative George Sinner, the Democrat, has won the race for governor in North Dakota.
That's an upset.
Yes.
Alan Olson.
Alan Olson is the incumbent. He was a Republican. The Democrats have picked up a net gain of 1 in the governors in North Dakota. Now, there are some others we have not yet called, and for these reasons. In Washington, because the polls are still open. In West Virginia, because it's too close. And in Vermont, because it's too close.
We also haven't called Illinois. And we haven't, did you mention Montana and Oregon?
No, I was talking about governor.
I'm sorry, talking about Senator. We also haven't called the senator's race in Illinois, Alaska, Montana, and Oregon. Let us, however, try to bring you up to date as to what Senate races we have projected throughout the evening and simply look at a list of them. I'm getting an altogether different instruction, so why don't you go ahead and tell me. Okie dokie. That's good. The roundup of the Senate from the man who covers the Senate. Sandy Van Ocker in Washington.
Thank you, Peter. As of now, the Republicans have lost one seat in the Senate. There's been a net loss of one. The Democrats have made a net gain of one. The Republicans picked up the seat in, Kentucky, the Huddleston seat. Democrats have picked up the Republican seat in Tennessee, vacated by Howard Baker. The net plus comes from Iowa, where Tom Harkin, the congressman, has defeated the incumbent Senator Roger Jepsen. But the seat that we're all waiting for, not just because it'll fundamentally alter the power structure in the Senate in terms of numerical advantage, is the seat in Illinois, where Charles Percy is seeking his fourth term, and right now he's running behind Congressman Paul Simon. Now, what's important about this is if Percy loses, then the man who becomes next entitled to be Senate Foreign Relations Chairman is Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who won re-election tonight. He's presently the Chairman of Agriculture. He has said he'll stay as Chairman of Agriculture. The people I talked to yesterday in North Carolina, people on the Republican side of the aisle I talked to today in the Senate, say he will become Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Why? The Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee has had not really much influence since Walter George defeated the Bricker Amendment in 1954. Bill Fulbright was the Chairman, he lost. Frank Church was the Chairman, he lost. Clifford Case was the ranking member from New Jersey, he lost. And then Jacob Javits was ranking member on the Republican side, and he lost. Why does Jesse Helms want to do this? One, his supporters want him to do this. Secondly, it's my belief that he wants to do it because I think he wants to run for president in 1988. At the Detroit Convention in 1980, he was being pushed to run for vice president, and he might. Now, Jesse Helms, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, will be in a powerful position to do a powerful lot in the next 4 years, especially if Robert Dole is seeking the presidency and Robert Dole succeeds in becoming majority leader of the Senate. Jesse Helms tonight is sitting in the catbird seat. Whether or not he takes the Foreign Relations chairmanship, if he does, if Percy loses in Illinois, he is a very powerful man in this country for the next 4 years.
Sandy, thank you very much indeed. In just a couple of minutes, we are going to talk to one of the men who has tried very hard to unseat Senator Percy in Illinois, Richard Viguerie, who, among other things, is the mailgram, even though he's a Republican, and who is the mailgram king of politics in this country. Let us, however, first take a quick look at the popular vote. With 35% of the precincts reporting in from around the country, Mr. Reagan is getting 59% of the vote with 18 million. Mr. Mondale is getting 13 million, about 41%, and someone has just handed me a card which says the turnout is about the same as in 1980, about 52.6% of the voting age population. It is up slightly in the Northeast, and it is up slightly in the West, and it is down slightly in the South and down slightly in the Midwest. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News coverage of the 84 vote continues from ABC News election headquarters in New York.
We're back, and the numbers you have just seen there tell the story of what has happened in the Electoral College, the electoral votes so far tonight. 13 for Mondale, 454 for Reagan. Now we're going to switch to Falls Church, Virginia, I think, but I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, and talk to Richard Viguerie, who is editor of the Conservative Digest, who is active in conservative Republican circles, and whose views on what has happened tonight should be interesting. Dick, are they interesting?
They are indeed, David. This is probably not quite as exciting as 1980, not quite as much tension, because the presidential election was probably foregone conclusion many months ago. But this is a historic thing. I think for 2 elections in a row now, the conservatives have won solidly, 49 states or so. And I think something is happening in the country since 1966. The liberals have been suffering defeat after defeat. 18 years now, there's been an anti-liberal trend. I think that the Democratic Party is in serious trouble as long as they keep this leftward direction, and the Republicans could be looking at becoming the majority party.
Mr. Viguerie, if you put it in party terms, I think you understand what you're saying. But if we look at our exit polls tonight, 43% only of the voters who've been out and cast votes today have described themselves as conservatives.
Doesn't that make it less than the conservative victory you're describing? Well, Well, we can look at it a number of ways, Peter. Can you imagine if the 2 elections in a row, if the Conservatives had won 4 years ago 6 states, and today if they'd won 1 state, I think there'd be a lot of people on the airwaves talking about the death of the conservative movement in this country. And I think that, you can play a lot of games with the polls. You can ask the questions a lot of different ways. We've heard a lot about how people really didn't agree with Ronald Reagan on the issues. They agreed with Walter Mondale on the issues, but they were voting for Ronald Reagan because of his personality. I think that's selling the American voters a little short. I think they understood quite well that Mondale was a liberal and Reagan was a conservative, and that's why they gave the president this landslide.
Now, let me ask you something about yourself and the conservative movement generally. In the Illinois election of a senator, Charles Percy is the Republican, and Paul Simon is a Democrat. I have seen you quoted as saying the party and the country would be better off if Simon won, because you don't like Percy's views.
Exactly, David. Nothing personal. I'm
spinning it out a little thin.
Well, for many years, the conservatives have been very disillusioned with Chuck Percy's voting record, with his every election coming along and saying, well, I've learned my lesson, I've reformed, I'm going to vote different. And then he goes back to his liberal ways, and I think it finally caught up with him. And David was a very powerful influence on the president, I'm afraid, in foreign policy. He trashed most of the conservative nominees when they came before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was very difficult to get a conservative confirmed through his committee. And if he's not chairman of that committee, it's going to make it a lot easier to get conservatives into the foreign policy area.
Could I possibly solicit a one-word answer from you? If Senator Percy loses, will Senator Helms automatically take the chairmanship of the Foreign Relations Committee?
That's up to Senator Helms. He's said he's going to stay as chairman of Agriculture. I take him at his word.
Thank you very much for joining us, Richard Viguerie, editor of the Conservative Digest. What has been shaping up this evening is this battle for the House. So let's go down to Washington now to Charles Gibson for an update on the shape of the House battle this evening, Charlie.
Peter, I want to say right off that I am not going to be bronzed at the end of the evening and be one of these statues. I just so that you can tell me from the statues, that's all. Peter, at the moment, it is too early to make any kind of projection on what's going to happen in the House in terms of final numbers. There are about 25 races at the moment that are frankly just up in the air, and you can't do that. I think it is safe to say at this point that in 1982, you'll recall, the Republicans lost 26 seats to the Democrats, and I think it is now safe to say they are not going to gain 26 seats back tonight. But anything more than that is impossible to say. At the moment, we have the Republicans showing a gain of 6. The Republicans have picked up 6 from the Democrats. They have not lost any. I will quickly run through the seats that the Republicans have picked up. The 5th District of Connecticut, the 1st District of New Hampshire, where Dudley lost to Bob Smith, North Carolina 4, where the former athletic director at the University of North Carolina beat Ike Andrews, Indiana 8, New Jersey 11, where a 22-year veteran Joe Minish lost, and in Texas, the 26th District of Texas, Tom Vandergriff, the former mayor of Arlington, Texas, has lost after 1 term in the House. But I think we're going to have, obviously, more seats going to the Republicans. I think Jack Kemp is premature in saying that, as I said earlier, that the Republicans are going to pick up more than 20. It looks like it'll be somewhere in that range, but way too early to make a final projection on the House. Gentlemen?
Charles, all right, thank you. Now, in the inevitably in the case of a victory as one-sided as this, Mr. Reagan has carried it so far. Some are still voting. Mr. Reagan has carried every state except Minnesota, Mondale's home state. A decisive, sweeping defeat for the Democratic ticket. Inevitably, the question then becomes what happens to the Democratic Party, and we will explore that question before the evening is over as best we can. Now, Ann Compton is talking with Senator Percy of Illinois, who at the moment, I understand, is running a little behind. Is that right, in our figures? Anyway, Ann, come in.
Well, we can't hear Ann Compton at the moment, but let us broach, if we will, this subject, which comes up every time any single party gets in trouble like this. What happens to the X party? And in this case, at the moment, happens to be the Democratic Party. Let's take an initial look at an assessment done by Jeff Greenfield.
Happy days are here again. Time was when presidential election days were mostly happy days for Democrats, but not lately. The world's oldest enduring political party has fallen on hard times. It's not just that Democrats have lost 4 of the last 5 presidential elections, it's how they've been losing, and even winning. In the last 40 years, only once, in 1964, has the Democrat won more than 50.1% of the popular vote. In that same period, Republicans have won 5 presidential landslides. What's gone wrong? Part of it is geography. You win the White House by winning states. In the last 5 elections, 23 states with 202 electoral votes this year have voted Republican every time. That's 3/4 of the votes needed to be elected president. And how many have gone Democratic every time? Only the District of Columbia. Democrats used to talk about the solid South. In the last 5 elections, the Democrats carried the South once with native son Jimmy Carter in 1976. In the big industrial states, Democrats used to pile up huge margins in the cities, but city populations have shrunk, the suburbs have grown, and suburban living, with property and school taxes, tends to make voters more Republican. And don't sell real issues short. From civil rights to Vietnam to busing and quotas, deep divisions have split apart what once was the Democratic coalition. White ethnic from black, hawk from dove, those who see government as a helping hand from those who see it as a tax taker. Democrats still control the House of Representatives. They have a fair shot at the Senate in 1986. They control more governorships than do the Republicans, and more Americans say they're Democrats. But at least in presidential election years, the facts suggest that the Democrats may have become a permanent minority party. Gentlemen?
Jeff, thank you. I might say here, everyone knows it, but I'll say it anyway, there are 5 states where people are still voting. California, Oregon, Alaska, Washington, and Hawaii. And all but Alaska will be closed in about 10 minutes. Alaska is open until midnight, our time.
Just to make another point about that, David, one of the reasons there's always been concern about this voting in the West is because President Carter in 1980 conceded before some of the polls were closed. Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan have both said this evening that they are not going to make any speeches, period, until the polls are all closed on the West Coast.
Okay. Now, the question of what happens to the Democratic Party from this point onward, we're going to turn to our What Does It Mean department with Will, Wicker, and Walters, beginning with Walters. Barbara?
What it means, first of all, is isn't it convenient that all our names begin with W? At least we have alliteration if we don't have agreement. If the Democratic Party is indeed worn out, as young people seem to think it is, and they're going to be voting for a long time, and they now seem to be voting Republican, what happens to the Democratic Party?
Well, there are 2 Democratic parties and there are 2 Republican parties. We have the presidential competition. The Republicans have a heavy winning record in that since 1856, since our 2 parties began competing with one another. There's still many more elected officials in this country are Democrats than Republicans. A plurality of Americans still want to vote for the Democratic Party if the Democratic Party will make it easy. The problem is the 2 parties have been defined by 2 great events, both of which were at the moment defeats. The Goldwater defeat in 1964 nevertheless brought in people who seem to have been on the right side of history, the conservative movement. The 1972 McGovern takeover of the party filled the party apparatus with people who simply will not learn from what happened to them in 1972.
But where do they go from here? What do you think? We talk about polarization, black versus white vote. Gary Hart said you need new ideas. We don't seem to have new ideas with the Democrats. What are they going to do to get their act together in the presidential election?
Well, the first thing you have to realize, it seems to me, not to take too Pollyanna-ish a view here, is that the Democrats have faced Ronald Reagan for the last time. That's a plus. The first thing they need to do is to get themselves a television candidate like Ronald Reagan. Now, that may be difficult to do, but that's one of the first things they need. And I think a third thing that you need to remember is that between the next, no, it's not cynical, it's a practical fact of American political life today. And I think the third thing you need to remember is that before there's another presidential election, there's going to be 4 years of government in here. And if those 4 years of government are as disastrous as I think they may be on both domestic and foreign policy, why, the Democrats might come roaring back. No one was saying that the Democrats were dead in 1982 when unemployment was up around 11%.
Is it simply that the Republicans, the country is to the right of center and the Democrats are to the left of center?
I think it's that simple, and I think if the Democrats listen to Tom Wicker, they're going to have create a Republican era, Tom. I mean, the idea that it's television...
To what I just said? They get a television candidate? Of course not.
So you don't think it's issues at all?
But to the extent that the Democrats buy the
the fantastically soothing doctrine that it's only the telegenic and cosmetic aspects of this, that they can go ahead and avoid the unaccustomed torture of thought, then they're in deep trouble.
George, I'm not saying that.
Tom, the presidential candidate in the history of this republic who got the most votes is Richard Nixon. A less telegenic person never existed. More people have voted for him than any other candidate because they agreed with him by and large on the issues.
George, I understand that, and that was, I would remind you, 12 years ago, however. All I'm saying is not that television is the only thing, but I'm saying that the way you project what you are and what people want to vote for is through television.
Yeah, but what are they? I mean, if indeed they used to feel,
well, of course,
especially if you were young,
I'm not arguing that point.
Yeah, but if I'm saying, what is the Democratic Party? If you used to feel that the Democratic Party was the party that was far-seeing, was the party of the people, was the party of youth, and now it just seems boring and worn out. What are they now? The party of what?
I'm not saying that that's not true, and I thought Jeff Greenfield's analysis was very sound. But I am saying that things can change very, very rapidly. They have changed very rapidly in the past. No one was making this analysis in 1982 when you had 11% unemployment. If you get 11% unemployment again in 1988, which is not impossible, high interest rates, other things of that kind, the Democrats will be
Barbara,
right back in there without any further
in
thought.
most states of the Union, the two most popular politicians are the President of the United States, who's a Republican, and the governor, who's a Democrat. And that governor, who's a Democrat, is governing in many states under a constitutional requirement to balance the budget. He's a tight-fisted executive, and he is much more in tune with the country than the Washington Democratic Party.
If what Tom says, they need candidates who are sparkling on television, one of the things they have to learn is to talk fast, which is what I'm going to do now. We have to stop because I think that we have coming up an interview with Senator Percy. We'll go back now
Barbara,
to
we do indeed.
Peter.
But first I have a quick projection. In West Virginia, we project the election of Governor Arch Moore, a Republican moving in and replacing a Democrat. Now we're going to Chicago, and Ann Compton, who is talking to Senator Charles Percy. Ann?
David, indeed, it is too close to call here in Illinois. And Senator Percy, you heard Richard Viguerie a few moments ago. Has some of that conservative money that has been spent against your campaign, aside from the Democratic candidate that you're running against, done something? Is that why you are running so far behind President Reagan in this state?
I don't think we should detract from Paul Simon's 10 years in Congress. He was lieutenant governor, and he ran for governor. He's well known. But also, never in the history of Illinois have we had so much money pour in from outside the state. One individual spent $1,200,000 from Southern California to try to influence the Illinois vote.
You have been chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Is that one of the disadvantages that has played? You have been accused of thinking more of Paris, France than Paris, Illinois. Is that one factor this year?
It's not really a factor. It's been used by every opponent in the primary and the general. But in Illinois, quite different from other states. We're very much international minded. 85% is the minimum poll that I've seen, indicating that being chairman of that committee in Illinois is an actual advantage for Illinois.
Senator Percy?
Let me interrupt you.
Why are you?
We both want to have that.
I'm afraid everybody in New York wants to ask you questions, too.
Some Southern Californians sent over $1 million into Illinois trying to defeat you. Who was it?
Michael Golden, a businessman who's made a great deal of money, and he just is determined. He's a one-issue person. He's absolutely determined to demonstrate that he can, in a sense, buy the seat.
Well, Senator,
and defeat the incumbent.
Senator, you spent over $4 million, if I'm not mistaken. If you do win tonight, would it have been worth it?
Citizens for Percy have, of course.
Well, all right. Your campaign has spent $4 million. If you win tonight, will it have been worth it?
Certainly, the effort is worthwhile. I want to be part of the economic recovery program. I'm thrilled at the mandate people of the country have for President Reagan's reelection and George Bush. That mandate is important all over the world. It's going to mean a continuation of this economic policy, and arms control will move forward rapidly now, and I think peace will continue. I want to be a part of that, of course. But I think both Simon and myself have spent equal amounts. What we have in addition to that is this outside money that's come in, particularly from one individual.
Senator Percy, thank you very much for joining us.
And thank you.
We want to just do a quick wrap-up now as to where we are. Let us take first a quick look at the popular board. 39% of the precincts reporting in. Mr. Reagan has 58% of the popular vote. Mr. Mondale has 41%. On the electoral board, which is the real story of the evening, Mr. Reagan has 454. and Mr. Mondale has 13. By the way, the greatest number of electoral votes ever won was 523 by Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, and in the 1972 Richard Nixon landslide, he won 520. David?
Well, Reagan has 454 now, and California is still to come. Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Alaska. They're all still open, so we can't call them. In any case, we have seen a tremendous sweep. We have seen the beginning of the end of the Mondale voyage, which he describes as having been longer than Columbus's and having discovered less, the end of it.
We are going to go away for half an hour now for local news, but we do expect Walter Mondale may come out after 11 o'clock Eastern Time, which could be in about 2 or 3 minutes or any time there. If Mr. Mondale does come out, we are going to cut into the local news, or give you the opportunity to cut into your local news, to see Mr. Mondale come out and speak to his supporters. So we just want you to know with that. Other than that, we will be back with the concluding national results, particularly in the West Coast, at 11:30. Hope you'll join us then. Thank you for staying with us this far.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. A few minutes ago, I called the President of the United States and congratulated him on his victory for re-election as President of the United States. Please. He has won. We are all Americans. He is our President, and we honor him tonight. Again tonight, the American people, in town halls, in homes, in firehouses, in libraries, chose the occupant of the most powerful office on earth. Their choice was made peacefully, with dignity, and with majesty. And although I would have rather won, Tonight we rejoice in our democracy. We rejoice in the freedom of a wonderful people, and we accept their verdict. I thank the people of America for hearing my case. I have traveled this nation, I believe, more than any living American. And wherever I've gone, the American people have heard me out. They've listened to me. They've treated me fairly. They've lifted my spirits, and they've added to my strength. And if there's one thing I'm certain of, it is that this is a magnificent nation with the finest people on earth. I thank above all my family. How lucky I am. Joan has campaigned with class all over this nation. We're very proud of our kids, Ted and Eleanor Jane and William. Everywhere they went, they got us support. And I thank Geraldine Ferraro. We're very proud of Jerry. Very proud of Jerry.
We didn't win, but we made history, and that fight has just begun. And once again, here I am in Minnesota. In over 24 years, never once have the people of Minnesota turned me down, including tonight. Minnesotans, this is a special state, a remarkable state with a special spirit. And time again in the past.
Well, we sensed that was going to happen a couple of seconds ago. We've temporarily lost the signal from Minnesota. Let's go back to it now and keep it as best we can.
And I want to especially thank my staff, Jim Johnson and the whole crew, my workers and my volunteers all over this country. What a special group of Americans they are. I know what you've sacrificed for me and for my country. And I want to say a special word to my young supporters this evening. I know how you feel because I've been there myself. Do not despair. This fight didn't end tonight. It begins tonight. I've been around for a while, and I have noticed in the seeds of every victory are to be found the seeds of defeat, and in every defeat are to be found the seeds of victory. Let us fight on. Let us fight on. My loss tonight does not in any way diminish the worth or the importance of our struggle. The America we want to build is just as important tomorrow as it was yesterday. Let us continue to seek an America that is just and fair. Tonight especially, I think of the poor, the unemployed, the elderly, the handicapped, the helpless, and the sad, and they need us more than ever tonight. Let us fight for jobs and fairness. Let us fight for these kids and make certain they have the best education that any generation ever had. Let us fight for our environment and protect our air, our water, and our land. And while we keep America strong, let's use that strength to keep the peace, to reflect our values, and to control these weapons before they destroy us all. That has been my fight. That has been our fight in this campaign. And we must fight for those goals with all of our heart in the future. I am honored by Minnesota, by all the people of this country that have permitted me to wage this fight. What an honor it is. And I'm at peace with the knowledge that I gave it everything I've got. confident.
For those stations around the country who have just rejoined us, this is Walter Mondale in St. Paul, Minnesota, making his concession speech.
Let us be determined to fight on. Good night, and God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Concession speech from Walter Mondale, and we'll be back to review some of tonight's results right after this.
That was a great game. Hey, what do you say we grab?
Dad, we ain't that loud, sweet.
Hey, I've got it. How about some...
Again? How about something different this time?
How about,
Pizza Hut! Pan pizza! All right!
Pan pizza at Pizza Hut. When you're looking for specialized cheese, lots of tasty toppings.
How about next week we...
Pan pizza!
At your hometown Pizza Hut.
Let's recap for you now the results of the top races in Tennessee tonight. In the presidential balloting, as you can see, Ronald Reagan swept the state of Tennessee with 58% of that vote. In the race to replace Howard Baker in the U.S. Senate, Al Gore Jr. will be going to Washington to represent Tennessee. In the 6th Congressional District, the battle to replace Al Gore in Congress, Bart Gordon won handily over Joe Simpkins. And the winner of the 4th Congressional District seat is Jim Cooper. He gets a second term, defeating James Sr.
And we're going to take a break. We'll go back to Peter Jennings and review some more of the national stories. And now that Walter Mondale has conceded, there will be a victory speech sometime in the next few minutes from Ronald Reagan. We'll be joining that.
Maintaining perfection. That is the task of Madison Smith Naturally. Maintaining perfection with an award-winning service department and sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Maintaining perfection with more than 15,000 finely honed authentic parts. Maintaining perfection, now at 666 Lafayette across from Sears. Maintaining perfection at Madison Smith Naturally. There's a time and a place for everything.
WKRN, Nashville.
ABC projects that California, with its 47 electoral votes, the largest number of electoral votes in the nation, has gone for Mr. Reagan, as has the state of Oregon, with its 7 electoral votes. And while we're at it, we also want to make a Senate projection in the state of Oregon. Mark Hatfield, who is the incumbent Republican, has defeated the state senator Margie Hendrickson and retained his seat. He was running for a 4th term in Oregon. Senator Mark Hatfield is returned to the Senate. David?
Britt Hume is somewhere in the St. Paul Civic Center. Britt, can you hear me?
I can, David.
Come in and tell us what you see there, will you?
Well, David, I just couldn't help remarking as I was listening to Walter Mondale make that concession speech how very like Walter Mondale it was. It was gracious, every word of it. There's one thing that Walter Mondale has refused to do at any time this year, and that is to gloss over, as he calls it, any of his failures or losses or shortcomings. And he certainly did nothing in anything that he said tonight to minimize the defeat that he has received. And yet, as you noted, he never looked hangdog for a moment. His smile never faded. His congratulations to Mr. Reagan seemed genuine and heartfelt. Indeed, for a moment there, it seemed that he was well ahead of his supporters in that department. There were some boos when he talked about having lost. He raised his hand to calm them. Walter Mondale has shown all of us who have covered him through this year that he is a man of considerable grace, and he has been a remarkable sport about all this, because I think that, as we discussed earlier, he knew that something like this was coming.
Britt, this may even sound outrageous, but he gives the impression, as he often did at the end of primary losses, that he doesn't mind losing. How badly does he mind losing?
Oh, I think he minds losing very much, Peter. I think he did have some preparation for this, because I think that after he failed to gain ground in the second debate, neither he nor his top aides could see any other turning point which might have moved the race in his direction. So I think that he thought that a loss was a distinct possibility, and he is a man very much concerned with doing things in the right way, with displaying the proper spirit. And I think that's what you're seeing there. You're not seeing a man who is enjoying losing. there may be some relief that this is all over. As has been remarked earlier this evening, this was a long and very grueling year for Walter Mondale, in which he had to fight off an enormously potent challenge from Gary Hart to win the nomination, and then it was a struggle to try to unite the party and to get past the Ferraro family finance crisis and finally get on to the general election. So he is a very tired man tonight, and perhaps relieved that this ordeal, or the ordeal part of it, is over. But make no mistake about it, he's not a man who enjoys losing at all.
Well, with varying degrees of intensity, he's been running for president now for about 4 years, Britt.
He certainly has, David, and I think that that very fact gives you some sense of the disappointment he must feel. This was an effort that was really years in the making, and he is a man who is given to very careful preparation and planning for things. I think that it may even be fair to say that this presidential bid was 10 years in the making, that he's been thinking about it for a long time. You'll remember he made sort of a false start for the 76 race and then dropped out, deciding that he wasn't ready, didn't want to spend too much time in Holiday Inns, as he put it at the time. And then, of course, he was tapped for the vice presidency in 76 and had, I think, what is by general agreement the most active and important role as a vice president up to that time in American history. So I think he is a man who feels he was ready. He made an enormous effort to organize a potent campaign. He saw the effort to unite the Democratic Party early shattered by Gary Hart's surprising upset in New Hampshire and the difficulty Mondale had in regaining his balance thereafter. It has been a long struggle for him, one he very badly wanted to win, one I think he hoped he could win. And Gary Hart said something earlier this evening about the Mondale campaign that I think is absolutely right, that early on in this general election, they made the decision to do what they would have to do to try to win the race, not just to win the base Democratic states and have a respectable showing, but to try to win. That meant going into the South. It meant going into California. It meant going into places where it was going to be very difficult for Walter Mondale to overcome Ronald Reagan's popularity. In the end, I think it cost him in the industrial states in the Northeast and Midwest, where if he had campaigned more earlier, he might have shown better. But he tried to win, and he is very disappointed tonight that he did not.
Well, Britt, I want to make a couple of points by way of getting to another question. And the first point is that ABC News now projects the state of Washington with its 10 electoral votes for Mr. Reagan, which gives Mr. Reagan 518 electoral votes, but also gives him every state in the country except Minnesota and also the District of Columbia. And it raises the point, for me at least, at this, as I said, cruel moment. He's only 56 years old. His mentor, Hubert Humphrey, who tried this, went back into the Senate. What do you think Mr. Mondale is going to do now?
Well, Walter Mondale has really never been anything except a public official. He was involved in politics almost from the moment he got out of college. He was involved in politics to some extent while he was in college. And he has held public office of one kind or another almost the whole time he has been an adult. And I don't think he really knows anything else. I suspect he will go and practice law in some lucrative fashion. No doubt his services will be much in demand. He's a sharp lawyer. He was the Attorney General of this state. But I suspect that sooner or later he will want to get back into public office. And he, as you remarked, he's only 56. I wouldn't be surprised to see Walter Mondale run for the Senate. I'll tell you one other thing, though. In the short run, I wouldn't be surprised to see Walter Mondale doing a lot of fishing and hunting and skiing. Gentlemen?
Brent, thank you very much. We have now been able to project all of the 48 contiguous states, and the only ones we have not been able to project are Alaska, which is where the polls are still open, and Hawaii, which we simply don't have yet.
That was a very gracious correction, David. I did turn around and look at the map, and Alaska's not on our map, and nor is Hawaii.
No. As you see, one state is blue for Mondale, everything else is red for Reagan. We'll be back. Waiting to be heard from is the president himself, who will be making his remarks sometime shortly, Mrs. Ferraro, and we, of course, will be here for that. And we'll be back in a moment.
ABC News coverage of the 84 vote will continue in a moment.
We've just seen a minute ago Walter Mondale's speech of concession. The people who have been traveling with him on his airplane in the last days, when he has known he was going to win, notice that very often he sat off alone in a seat by the window, quietly, looking out, just watching the landscape pass by, and looking down at all those states that were not going to vote for him. Peter?
Speaking of states, I'd like to welcome Alaska and Hawaii back into the Union.
Oh, I'm sure they will be happy to hear that.
The polls have not closed in Alaska. If I'm not mistaken, they will not close there for about 50 minutes. The polls have closed in Hawaii. They closed at 11 o'clock Eastern time, so about 45 minutes ago. But we haven't got any vote in from there as yet. I was just looking, David, at some of the polls. You know, we were talking about not so much how Mr. Mondale lost at that moment, but Mr. Reagan's strengths are really very considerable. He won 49% of the Hispanic vote. That's much better than expected. 58% of the Italians. Geraldine Ferraro does not appear to have been any help there. By the way, we are waiting for Geraldine Ferraro to come down and make a statement. She wasn't going to say anything until Mr. Mondale did. There was no gender gap apparent. Mr. Reagan won 55% of women, 63% of men, 59% of blue-collar workers. Mr. Mondale's strengths appear to have been, in a sense, those people he was talking to in his closing campaign, or his closing remarks there. 89% of the black vote, 64% of the unemployed, and 70% of the Jewish vote, better than Jimmy Carter did in 1980.
Well, all of that raises a question that we can't answer now, but we will discuss it a bit when we have time and see what thoughts people have. Is this a personal triumph for Mr. Reagan, or is it some sort of political expression of a broad-gauged nature on the part of the American people? I'm not sure I know the answer, but I would like to hear somebody else's thoughts about it when we get a chance. Again, we're waiting for Geraldine Ferraro to appear here in New York in a hotel in Manhattan, not in Queens, to say whatever she has to say, and when that time comes, we, of course, will take you there to hear it. We also are waiting to hear from Mr. Reagan, who is in Los Angeles, and he, as Peter, I think you said, they all agreed, in fact, that they would not say anything, either concede or claim victory until after the last poll closed in California, last in the 48 states, and they have done that.
Do you know, in answer to your question a second ago about what we do know and what we don't know, one thing we do know at this point is that the House vote is very slow coming in. But looking at it as it does come in now, it does appear that while Mr. Reagan has had some coattails, they have not penetrated quite as deeply as the Republicans had hoped for. So I think if you use that as a yardstick at this moment, you may be seeing what you, in a sense, define yourself a Reagan victory, and not necessarily this realignment that people have been talking about ad nauseum for the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Well, I've got the last and best figures we have, and they will get better as we get more votes in, is that it looks now as if the maximum number of House seats the Republicans might gain tonight is about 25. Which is almost exactly what they lost in the off-year election in 1982. I think a week ago they would have been delighted to know that they were going to get 25. They were talking about 10, maybe 12.
Yeah, but yesterday they were talking about 30 and things like that. So that doesn't appear to be shaping out. You just saw, by the way, Geraldine Ferraro, who is waiting to come out and make her remarks, having suffered a fairly crushing defeat at the hands of the Republican ticket. She did tell her staff last night, or tonight actually, that nobody should shed any real tears because she had not done as well as she would have liked to have done as the first woman on a presidential ticket. We'll come back and hear Ms. Ferraro right after this.
This country may be in danger. We could be losing something we can't afford to lose. Once in this country, when a man produced a product, it was the best he could possibly make. He stood behind it with pride. He lived a simple idea. Do it right or don't do it at all. Nobody told him that. No government agency dictated it. And it built a standard of living for the world to aim at. Now that idea is threatened by the slipshod, the second rate. To some it means quick riches. To some it means quick death of the standards we have built. Some are fighting this threat. Whirlpool Corporation believes in one simple idea. To continue to build and sell only good quality, honest appliances, designed to give you your money's worth, and to stand behind them with pride, or they will not build them at all. If we can't keep this simple idea alive, then indeed we are the endangered species.
Those are Geraldine Ferraro's headquarters in New York, where a large crowd is waiting to hear her make her remarks. We might just tell you before she talks that her home district of Queens, which she has ably represented in the Congress and where she was extremely popular tonight, went for Mr. Reagan 55 to 45%.
I might say here to ABC stations across the country that because Mrs. Ferrara is that's her mother there with her, about to speak, we rather think we will not be able to cut away at 52 as we have been during the evening. You will understand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're very nice. Thank you. Thank you. You're great. I want to thank you all. Thank you so much. I want, first of all, to congratulate President Reagan, and I have just telephoned Vice President Bush to convey my best wishes to him as well. They ran a skillful, I thought I finished with hecklers last night. They ran a skillful, spirited campaign, and today they have achieved an impressive victory. Tonight, the campaign ends. The race is over. This is not a moment for partisan statements. It is a moment to celebrate our democracy and to think of our country. The American people have put their trust in President Reagan. And in the interest of the nation, with hope for the future, I ask all Americans to join together, work together, and pledge our support for our president in the search for a more just society, a strong America, and a world at peace. Tonight, I would also like to thank my running mate and my friend, Walter Mondale. For more than 2 decades, he has forsaken personal gain to promote the public good. He has fought for people who need our help. He has stood up for everyone in the last 25 years. And even though he did not win this race for the presidency, in 1984 he waged another battle, a battle for equal opportunity, and that battle Walter Mondale won. For 2 centuries, candidates have run for president. Not one from a major party ever asked a woman to be his running mate until Walter Mondale. When he asked me to be campaigned by his side, he opened a door which will never be closed again. That is a victory of which every American can be proud. Campaigns, even if you lose them, do serve a purpose. My candidacy has said the days of discrimination are numbered. American women will never again be second-class citizens. Elections also focus the nation's attention on the things that truly matter. In this campaign, Americans have all been made more aware of the danger of the nuclear arms race. We have all recognized the needs of our changing economy. We have all been reminded of the millions of Americans who have been counted out before their talents have been added up, and we can all take pride in those accomplishments. We live in a time of exciting change. This country built the space shuttle, the most sophisticated machine ever to fly, and a black and a woman were among the first to fly in it. From Argentina to the Philippines, there's a new awakening of freedom. And all over the world, people are calling for the opportunity to choose their own destinies. I think America can be the vanguard of change. I have faith in the American people, and I believe in this country. Our society is the fairest on earth, but we can work even harder for fairness. Our nation is at peace, but we can do even more to reduce the risk of war. America is a great nation. America is a great nation, but if there's one thing that our campaign has stood for, it is that our country can be even greater. That cause, our country's cause, is never finished, and I, for one, will continue to work for it. Tonight brings an end to a long campaign. This is a moment to rejoice in our democracy. It is also a moment for us to be proud. All of us can go to sleep tonight confident that we did everything we could to win this election. So let me say to our supporters throughout the country, to my staff, my family, and my friends, we fought hard, we gave it our best, and we made a difference. To be proud of what we have done. I am, and I thank you very, very much.
Lynn Scher of ABC, who covered Ms. Mondale, Ms. Ferraro, all the way through the campaign, back to the Democratic Convention in San Francisco when she was nominated. Lynn, can you hear me? If so, would you come in?
Sure, David, I can hear you. I was, of course, watching and listening to that speech the same as you. I think it's quite interesting. This, of course, is the first race that Geraldine Ferraro has ever lost, a three-term congresswoman. She won those races rather handily. All of a sudden, she finds herself a national candidate, and she lost the first one. However, I think it's really important to point out, Geraldine Ferraro campaigned for the chance to run this campaign. She wanted to be the vice presidential nominee. She also wanted to win the vice presidency. However, as soon as it became very obvious to the Democrats that they were not going to do that, something else happened. She and the party focused much more on her historic role. She talked about it in that speech we just heard, and when Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, introduced her just before she got up to the podium, he said the same thing. He said, "We made history in the United States, and we are bursting with pride at the magnificent performance of this woman from Queens." To a great extent, they really wanted the world to know that what they had done was make history. The Democrats made a commercial. The theme of it was, "Jerry, you've made us proud." I saw a sign in a crowd in this crazy week that we just went through. A little girl holding up a sign, a little cardboard sign. It said, "Thanks, Jerry." I believe that she believes that that, to a great extent, is what this campaign was all about.
Lynn, let me ask you a question. You know, our exit polls, as you know, are showing that she has not been a great success among women, that President Reagan has done fairly well. But you've covered her all throughout the country. She concentrated very heavily on women in the last couple of weeks. How do we judge whether or not she's really had an effect on women in the country?
Well, I think that's easy, Peter. We look to what happens in the future. Every single place we went, she drew out huge crowds and women who merely wanted to see her and feel her and touch her. Not all of them knew if they were going to vote for her. I'm not sure all of them did, but she was not. I believe what happened is that she will inspire plenty of other women in both parties to say that they too can run. She has, in fact, made it easier for other women, including Republican women.
We are waiting for Mr. Reagan to appear in Los Angeles to say whatever he has to say about his victory tonight, his tremendous victory tonight, and we will bring that to you whenever it occurs, probably in the next few minutes. In the meantime, here's where we stand with the popular vote and the electoral vote in today's election. The popular vote you see, 33 million votes. It's not all in, 62% of it. 33 million for Mr. Reagan and 23 million for Mr. Mondale, 59% to 41. And here are the electoral votes, the ones that count. 518 for Mr. Reagan, 13 for Mondale. The 13 came from his home state of Minnesota and from the District of Columbia. And behind us, as you see here, is our map. The red states went for Reagan. The blue state, singular, Minnesota, went for Mr. Mondale. It's his home state. And here in the studio with us, Benjamin Hooks, the NAACP. Thank you for coming in. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Have you seen the figures on voting in black areas of the country? And if so, tell us what happened.
Well, we've run an election watch special at our office, and we've had some key precincts over the country to call in. The results seem to be now that we did have a tremendously large black vote in those precincts which we have checked and followed. And the overwhelming majority went for Mondale. I would suspect 92 to 94%. That's our information we have.
You're talking about your Operation Hotline 84, which you ran tonight.
That's right.
You certainly raise a question. You've been one of the few groups in the country which has remained absolutely loyal to the Democratic Party tonight. What do you expect to get from it?
Well, it's not so much a matter of what we expect to get from it. It's a matter of getting the country on the right trail. We want to be in the lead. We want to be in the vanguard of those who are doing right. We believe that the Democratic Party, at this point, and NAACP is nonpartisan, we believe there ought to be a strong black presence in both the Republican and Democratic parties. But at this junction in history, the Democratic Party offers more for the black community and for the entire nation, so that black folk have followed it.
Does this election result tonight suggest to you in a very forceful way that blacks have got to start trying to make some kind of inroads into the Republican Party?
It suggests two things. Number one, and both of these the NAACP has been pushing for many, many years. One, within the Democratic Party, there must be coalition building. We cannot, as black folk, elect a president by ourselves, and in very few states can we elect a governor or senator. Therefore, we have to build coalitions in the Democratic Party. Secondly, we must have a stronger black presence in the Republican Party to redeem the soul of that party and to move it in the direction that it moved for many years until, let's say, 4 or 8 years or 12 years ago.
Mr. Hooks, you say you prefer to stay with the Democratic Party. So long as you do, and so long as they know you're going to vote for them, you don't have any leverage.
Well, I think that what is going to happen is that there will be a reassessment. The Democratic Party itself must reassess where it stands. For instance, the Democratic Party went into this election with a majority of governors, overwhelmingly so. They'll come out the same way. I think there'll be a net gain of 1 or 2 Democratic seats in the Senate, probably no more than 10 or 12 lost in the House. So the Reagan victory is a personal victory, not a Republican Party victory. The Republican Party must look at itself. When Bill Brock was Republican National Chairman, he made a determined effort to bring blacks and minorities into the party. I don't think that has happened lately. But I believe that whoever takes over in '88 must look at the fact that if you want to build a party as opposed to a personal, charismatic movement around one person, you must indeed include minorities in that party.
Mr. Hooks, we look forward to the day, obviously, in this country when questions of race don't come up on elections. But in the South tonight, it looks like blacks went Democrat, Republicans went white, particularly in the South. Are we seeing there a white backlash, do you think?
I think that you see some part of that. One thing that has happened in this nation, and I'm proud of being a part of that movement, most white people in this country will not look at the mirror and say to themselves, I am a racist. I don't like black folk. We've succeeded in eliminating that type of thinking for the large part. But there's a sort of a subliminal feeling in this nation that enough has been done for black people as a people. They must now get their own boot, their own strap, and try to pull themselves up. And I think that Reagan personifies that kind of thing. I don't perceive of Reagan as a racist in the old sense. I perceive of him as a man who has a lot of ideas that really won't work so far as the black community is concerned. And most white people in the South like the idea, number one, Mr. Reagan is personally a likable person, good speaker, a genial, and all of that thing. Number two, inflation has come down. We've got to admit that. The fact that the oil glut may have caused it, or that you had a tremendous depression, or that the unemployment among blacks is still high, is incidental. And thirdly, this whole idea of you know, the Wild West, John Wayne, macho image, Mr. Reagan stood tall in Grenada, and all that kind of thing. All of these things have combined to give him a big personal mandate. The party must be built, and I think that white people in the South reacted to that, as did white people in the North. But after all, it was not only in the South that white people voted for Reagan, they voted for him all over this country, except perhaps in Minnesota. And this other thing to remember is that there was a lot of ticket splitting tonight, because that was not the kind of sweep you would have expected with this kind of landslide electoral victory.
Very good point. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Benjamin Hooks, the director of the NAACP.
We are going to bring you up to date on the governor's races and the Senate races from Barry Serafin and Sander Van Ocker when we come back in a moment.
We are still waiting for President Reagan to make his appearance out in California to make his victory speech before this extremely large crowd of supporters out there at Reagan headquarters. While we are waiting, let us remind you again that we are still awaiting the opportunity to give you some definitive result of that very important Illinois Senate race, Senator Charles Percy against Congressman Simon. Although Simon does hold a lead here of just about 5%, 36% of the precincts in Illinois are still not heard from. And one of the reasons we can't do much with it is because they are largely Republican precincts that have yet to be heard from. So you see a Percy running behind in the popular vote, but Republican precincts, Senator Percy being the Republican, of course, which have not yet been heard from. David?
Now we're going to, before we go to Barry Serafin, I want to catch up on something that I know a great number of people are curious about. Well, I haven't had a chance to do it. In Montana, they're voting on a statewide initiative to put into the law the fact to allow non-dentists to sell false teeth. Well, I am, I don't know happy or not, but I am able to report now that this initiative is being approved. Now, you're
not a man in need, are you?
No, I just want to see justice done, that's all. Now, we're going to Barry Serafin, who's going to bring us up to date. Barry?
Well, David, it looks like Republicans are going to make some small gains in state houses around the country. Going into today's election, there were 35 Democrats and 15 Republicans in state houses. There were 13 seats at stake, 6 Democrats, 7 Republicans. And at this point, ABC News is projecting 12 of those races and a net gain for the Republicans of 2. Here are some of the winners in today's election that we have projected. Gardner in the state of Washington, Archmore in West Virginia. You see North Dakota, Rhode Island, Arkansas, Delaware, Missouri, North Carolina. And again, at this point, we're projecting a net gain of 2. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Barry. I think it's unfair if you have your moment of trivia and I don't have mine.
It's your moment.
We've been talking a lot about the Percy-Simon race and how it was one of the very expensive races. 4 years ago, a 30-second political advertisement on primetime television cost $50,000. Today, the same cost $125,000, and perhaps that's one of the reasons so much money was spent. We're going to cut away shortly, but I want to tell you that we are indeed waiting for the president to come out to his headquarters in California to make his victory speech. That is the last great, enormous piece of business waiting to be concluded this evening. But as of now, that is the national picture. At 22 minutes past the hour, we'll be back when the president comes back.